everyone, and welcome back to class number 5 of the free online private pilot ground school. So hopefully the federal aviation regulations are a bit easier to understand, although there are quite a few of them that we kind of have to commit to memory. Couple things people are asking me on Facebook and a few other locations were, how am I supposed to memorize all these? It's a lot of information. The way that I did it was I would read through, and remember, we made a cheat sheet for these as well. It's like a 2-page cheat sheet, and you can find it in the previous lesson for basically lesson number 4 on the federal aviation regulations. It's a Word document where I took the actual regulation and I kind of trimmed it down just to a bare bones meaning. You can kind of take those, and what I would recommend is just old-fashioned note cards. So anytime that I was flying a new airplane, or if I needed to, work on something for a check ride, or even for the airlines, these are all my old airline flashcards about different limitations for the Embraer Air. Because in the airlines, we actually have a check ride every 6 months, which is basically, we always need to kind of keep these in the back of our mind. So if you realize that you can kind of work through them, and the way that I would kind of do it is, if I started to get it 100% all the time, I would basically just put the flashcard to the side. And then what I would realize is that my main deck of flashcards would slowly start to kind of be chipped away until there's only a handful remaining, and that way you really know it as well. The other one is, you can drag the loved one, friend, family, coworker, anything else, and try to explain it to them. If you can teach it to someone else, then that also means that you know the material very well as well. And I recommend you do that with airspace as well. So see if you can persuade the kids or the wife to sit down with you and attempt to draw that airspace triangle and see if they understand your explanation or not. Okay. All right, so moving forward with class number 5 as we chug along through the week here. We're basically at the midpoint. Let's see what is on the agenda. So this is Airport Operations Part 1. Remember, this is a 2-part class, and before we actually get into Airport Ops, we are about 2/3 of the way done with the Part 91 regulations. So we have to basically continue with our federal aviation regulations with the Part 91. Still going to talk about aircraft airworthiness. We'll get into the Aero and the Aviated. Remember, Aero is our required documents that we have to have on board the aircraft. That's our mnemonic. And then we have a mnemonic Aviated for our required maintenance inspections that have to be complied with under certain circumstances. We will then also talk about the NTSB, the National Transportation Safety Board, Part 830, and it's really what are our obligations and requirements as pilots in the event that we get into an accident or incident. What is how soon do we have to report? And what you'll realize is that it's either an immediate notification, 7 days, or 10 days, depending on the circumstance. That's really the main thing we need to know there. Then what we'll do is, we never got to this the other day, but we'll go ahead and review the inoperative equipment. So we're going to have an example on, I believe it's just a basic Cessna. You go out to the airplane and something's going to be broken. And you're going to find this throughout your career as a student pilot and just as a pilot in general. As you're basically, getting, these aircraft are very much used and abused. So when you take the aircraft from another student, another instructor, you'll probably realize that maybe the taxi light's not working, one of the radios is not working, but the other one is. So it's always kind of in a constant state of flux, and maintenance is just something that happens, all the time in between flights. And the main thing we're really looking at is we're going to show you this flow chart and the requirements in terms of how do you determine if the airplane is still legal to fly, or if it's basically grounded and whatever piece of equipment is broken has to be repaired immediately before you can actually utilize it. So we're going to look at the exact order. We're also going to look at a minimum equipment list, which is something that we typically find in much larger aircraft. But we also need to know about that as well. After that, we'll switch gears, probably at that 1 hour, probably after the 1 hour break, because that's a lot of information. And we'll start talking about our airport operations. And the airport operations, we're going to initially talk about taxi and ground operations. We'll look at taxi diagrams, how runways are actually set up. How do we actually navigate from point A to point B? I'll give you an example of some complex taxi instructions and let you try to figure out how to get from point A to point B. We'll also look at airport lighting and diagrams. So there's specific light colors, and certain colors mean we're in certain places at an airport. So basically, if you're very simply surrounded by a bunch of blue lights at night, you're on a taxiway. If you're surrounded by a bunch of white lights at night, you're on a runway. So we'll look at that. We'll also get into our diagrams as well. So with that, we're going to be looking at airport signage, which is relatively unique for airports. Some of the signs will be a little bit similar to what your driving experience. If you see something in giant red letters, then typically you don't want to, go to that area. Or there's something that's a requirement like a stop sign or a no entry sign. So we'll look at those as well. Everything else, my guess is airport beacons, displaced thresholds will probably take over on the very last day of class here. So keep that in mind. Whatever we don't finish today, we'll roll over to the next class. But the goal is that airport operations for all of our classes are going to be finished at the end of the week. So whether you're ending on Thursday or Friday this week, we should all be at the exact same spot. And finally, everyone always wants to know what is the catch with our free online private pilot ground school. So as I always say, you guys have access to the live streams in 3 different locations, including on our website, YouTube, and Facebook. In addition to the live streams and the live classes, you guys have access to the recordings, which we post the day after on our website. You guys have access to our quizzes, handouts, documents, final exam, and the written test endorsement. And we'll talk about the criteria here in just a moment. So at the end of the day, there really is no catch to this class. Hopefully you'll see that as we move and kind of progress week by week here. The only thing that we will do at the end of the day, as I've always said, and you'll see this in every class, is that we will terminate the free access after about 5 days after our last day of class. So our class is a little bit unusual here just because we have the holidays, and I've showed you the calendar previous to this, but our last day of class is going to be on Wednesday, December 28th, and that is actually the same day that the final exam becomes available to you. So as a quick reminder, in order to get your FAA written test endorsement from our team of instructors here, all you need to do is watch all 12 of the classes. Does not matter whether it is live or recorded. Also does not matter what platform you watch it on, our website, YouTube, or Facebook, so you can mix and match whatever works for your schedule. And then finally, when the final exam becomes available, then it's a total of 60 questions. You'll have 2.5 hours to complete it, and you just need to get an 80% or higher. If you've been following along with any of the quizzes in each of the lessons, you'll have no problem basically taking that final. As a reminder, the quiz questions are the same ones that we use for the final exam, and we basically pull them together based upon certain percentages of each of the subjects. Even if you're scoring an 80%, I encourage you to continue taking the exam, and it's going to expose you to more FAA-like test questions. At the end of the day, you just need an 80%, and you have unlimited attempts to basically make that happen. 5 days after our last day of class, we'll put everyone on Monday, January 2nd, 2023. At 11:59 p.m. Pacific Coast time. That's when we're going to basically pull down the course and the access. So that's usually enough time for everybody to take the final. I've seen people take it 10, 20, 30 times in a 5-day period and also wrap up any remaining course material that you have. Once again, the reason why we do this is it gives us a higher completion rate. Right now, we've had over 100,000 students take our class. 95% of that cohort have actually gone on and completed the class, received the endorsement. And 99% of that group has gone on and taken the FAA written exam for the private pilot license, that is, or what we call private pilot airplane, and passed it on the first attempt. And finally, my little public service announcement. Just as a reminder, in the event that you do feel like you're going to need more time or you like the way that we teach, we do have the Check Ride Prep Private Pilot Lifetime Membership available. It was on sale all of last week. The sale will continue, but at a higher price now. So it is $169 or 3 payments of $57. We brought back in the payment system to try to make it as affordable as possible for people. This gives you not only access, obviously, to the private pilot ground school, you also have access besides just the live streams that you guys watch for free. We actually professionally record each one of our classes in a studio environment. There are no breaks. We basically break up the lessons. So instead of watching 12 3.5-hour lessons, it's more like watching 50 to 60 to sometimes 70 mini lessons, depending on the course. In addition to that, you have, up-to-date information. We're always ensuring that the federal aviation regulations are up to date, and any other changes that the FAA imposes are actually seen throughout the courses. You have unlimited practice quizzes and exams. I believe there's just shy of about 900 FAA-like test questions that we've uploaded for you. And the nice thing about our system is every time you guys take a quiz or a test, it does basically jumble the test questions so they don't ever look alike to try to, so that way you don't get into a habit of, let's say, memorizing the test question and the answer.
You also have instructor support from our team of instructors and customer service here 24/7. You'll be able to get the FAA written test endorsement beyond the date that I mentioned previously. You can also get FAA Wings credits as well. You'll have access to all the past webinars. We do live seminars and Q&As typically once a month. You'll be invited to those as well. And in addition to that, we have a couple bonuses. So the Private Pilot Flight Maneuvers course, these are all of the FAA flight maneuvers that you'll be required to learn. So this is basically putting into practice how to actually fly these step by step, look at the requirements, look at some of the common student errors that the FAA has identified, and so forth. And you'll also have access to the Private Pilot Companion Guide, which is our PDF version, which includes all the handouts and notes section, the FAA testing supplement. It also includes 120 pages of course notes done by instructors that have watched this course end to end. So the other benefit here too, like I've always said with this, is that you might finish your private pilot now, and it might be a year before you're ready to sit for your check ride. When you're preparing for your check ride, it's nice to be able to review some of the material that you may have found that you have a little bit of knowledge gaps in as well. So this is a perfect opportunity to do that. And you also support our mission, which is basically to provide these types of free courses ongoing to the public indefinitely. And it's really the few who pay for the many. It's the few folks who have allowed us to serve over 100,000 students from all walks of life, all ages, from majority in the United States, but also elsewhere around the world. So with that, that is it. That is my public service announcement. Let's go ahead and move on to today's material.
All right, so that is it with my announcements. I appreciate it, everybody. What we're going to do is we're going to push on with federal aviation regulations. There are still some more regulations that we have to cover. Where we left off the other day was we were talking about Part 91, which is basically our general operating regulations. And what we're going to start with is Part 91, and it's called 91.119. Remember, I always try to include the FAR number. And basically what I did was I boiled this down to the nuts and bolts of what you guys need to know. If you guys are interested in basically reading it verbatim, how the FAA is going to write it, kind of that legalese, you're more than welcome to look at the original, however it's originally written in their context. The other thing too is I do have a FAR, basically a Federal Aviation's cheat sheet that is you'll find in the last lesson. So if you guys go back to lesson number 4, underneath that recorded video that you guys would see from Monday, there is a Word document, and it has all of these in basically a 3-page format with kind of just very, very small summary or abbreviation of each one. So if you want to use that, you're more than welcome to. All right, so this is minimum safe altitudes. Once again, there is a catch-all rule with this. Rule number 1 is basically the catch-all rule that states no person may operate an aircraft below an altitude allowing an emergency landing to be made without undue hazard to persons or property on the surface in the event of an engine failure. Okay. So you're going to realize with rule number 2 and rule number 3, they're going to be based upon if you're in a congested area, such as a city or a town, or if you're in what is known as an other than congested area, think of like farmland or over open water. They will give you 2 different altitudes that you have to abide by. But if we go back to rule number 1, no matter what, you still have to be in an altitude in which you can make that emergency landing without basically harming any persons or property on the ground in the event you had a engine failure. Okay. So rule number 2 is basically dealing with the congested area. So this would be considered a city, a town, a settlement, or over any open air assemblies of persons. So if you're pretty much in an urban environment, and for the most part, some of the suburbs of the larger cities would also count as well. So this is what it would look like. You need to maintain at least 1,000 feet above the highest obstacle and 2,000 feet horizontally from whatever that highest obstacle is. So in the example we have here, we've got a 750-foot tall building, so they're going to be 1,000 feet above that. That would put their altitude at 1,750, and they're always going to maintain a 2,000 feet basically radius or be horizontal away from whatever that tall building is. Now, if you are potentially flying and you're kind of flying within the suburbs, usually it's just a bunch of houses, so there really is no tallest building, so there's really nothing to say that you need to be 2,000 feet away from something. But if you are kind of just in the suburbs and you're just flying over a bunch of houses, very simply, you just want to be 1,000 feet above those houses, AGL. And obviously, if you're flying in a larger metropolitan area that does have taller buildings, that's when you're going to kind of think back and remember that you also need to be 2,000 feet away from that building as well. Okay. All right, the other one that we have is our minimum safe altitudes in what is known as an other than congested area. Very simply, if you're kind of in more rural areas, or the example that I like to use out in Camarillo, California, here at the airport that we used to fly at, it's surrounded by farmland, and really that's going to be kind of that rural or other than congested area. The magic number that you want to know is 500 feet AGL, so 500 feet above whatever happens to be out there. Now, in the event you're maybe flying in farmland over here, and then you kind of get a bunch of houses, basically over the farmland, you'd want to be at 500 feet AGL, and then you'd obviously want to increase that if you start to move into more congested areas, and then you'd want to be at least at 1,000 feet AGL. But remember that catch-all rule, which is basically you always need to be at an altitude which allows you to make an emergency landing in the event of an engine failure, and basically not cause harm to either persons or property on the ground. The other one that we also have, which is a little bit different, is in sparsely populated areas. So this would apply if you're truly in the middle of nowhere, potentially farmland as well, or you're potentially just over water. At that point, then the thing that you need to remember is this statement right here, which is 500 feet from any person, vessel, vehicle, or structure. So very simply, if you are cruising the open sea of the Pacific, and magically there is a Viking boat, because that's the only thing I know how to draw, sorry guys, and you're basically flying along, you could fly along, if you really were, I guess, ballsy, you could basically fly along an inch above the surface of that ocean, and once you start approaching that vessel, in this case, you just need to be 500 feet away from it on all sides, and then you can basically drop back down to the ocean. So it's up to you. Just remember that, obviously use caution. If you catch a wave by accident, it might grab your landing gear and pull you down. But those are basically the numbers that you need to know at the end of the day. All right, so what we're going to do is we are going to go ahead and look at our next FAA test question here. And I'll see if I can answer any questions in between. So remember to please answer on the poll. Poll is open right now. Do not answer in the chat. Except when necessary for takeoff or landing, what is the minimum safe altitude required for a pilot to operate an aircraft over other than a congested area? Is it A, an altitude allowing, if a power unit fails, an emergency landing without undue hazards to persons or property on the surface? B, an altitude of 500 feet AGL except over open water or sparsely populated area, which requires 500 feet from any person, vessel, vehicle, or structure. Or C, an altitude of 500 feet above the highest obstacle with a horizontal radius of 1,000 feet. All right, got the first couple answers rolling in. Josh in Rapid City was asking, are the rules changed based on passengers? Nope, it is. These are basically the rules regardless if it's just by yourself or if you are flying with passengers. And hopefully Travis is out there fixing all the bugs and answering any tech questions. Remember, he's online on the website, so if you have any questions, he's there to help you. Got about a third of the class in so far. Right, there's about 80%, just waiting for a few stragglers here. Majority of you do have the correct answer, so that's good. All right, let's take a look at it. We've got 29% of the class with A, 62% of the class with B, and the whopping remaining part of the class at 8% with C. So the B's do have it, and the reason why that is the correct answer there is we just kind of have to look at and read the question very carefully. So other than, some of this you can kind of remove to kind of make the question a bit simpler. What is the minimum safe altitude required for a pilot to operate and it's over other than a congested area. So in this case, yes, A is the catch-all rule, but this is specifically asking over other than a congested area. That's the reason why it should be B, and it's going to be the altitude of 500 feet AGL, except over open water or a sparsely populated area, which requires 500 feet from any person, vessel, vehicle, or structure. Okay, so good job, everybody. Let's see, Jake was asking, when flying into small airfields in a city, can you break the 1,000-foot rule if you're on approach? Yep, so obviously if you are on approach or departure, basically you're taking off and you're landing, then this rule does not apply. That's really the only time that it doesn't apply. All right, 91-121, we learned about our altimeter the very, very first week of class, and the main thing that you guys need to remember here is that the regulations require that any time that you are operating an aircraft below 18,000 feet MSL, which is basically where Class Alpha airspace starts, you have to have a current altimeter setting at least at a minimum of every 100 nautical miles. So don't worry too much about how we get these. There's plenty of ways to get these, but we could get this from ATIS information when we're taking off or basically going to a towered airport. We can get this from different aviation weather services. We can get this from flight service stations. Really, the only thing that we need to pay attention to is making sure that we have a current altimeter setting at least every 100 nautical miles, since that is the regulation. Okay. The other folks who will also provide this to you is controllers. So if you are basically going on flight following and you're getting a handoff from one controller to another, they'll go ahead and remind you of whatever the local altimeter setting is in your area that you happen to be flying in. Okay. 91-123, this is air traffic control compliance. So this is a 4-part regulation as well. So part 1 is the regulation states that when air traffic control clearance has been obtained, no pilot in command may deviate from that clearance unless an amended clearance is obtained, emergency exists, or in response to a TCAS, a traffic alert and collision avoidance resolution advisory. So really the main thing is that if you guys end up getting a clearance, the only time you can deviate from that clearance, if they tell you to hold an altitude or hold a direction, you either need to get an amendment from that or there needs to be some type of emergency. This last little bit here, which is called a TCAS RA. The TCAS is basically mainly used for business jets and primarily in the airlines. The TCAS is basically just providing target information to the pilots of those airlines. And then the RA is called a resolution advisory. You guys won't have this technology, but if someone basically penetrates a certain area in and around an airline, the RA will come alive. And what we're supposed to do as pilots is basically disengage the autopilot. We have to manually fly it. And what the airplane computer is going to tell us to do is we're either going to climb at a certain rate. It'll tell us how many feet per minute we're supposed to climb or descend in order to avoid a collision. So you guys will not have that capability, but everything else still applies. Part 2 of the regulation basically states that except in an emergency, no person may operate an aircraft contrary to an air traffic control instruction in an area in which air traffic control is exercised. So if there is an area that has ATC services, which is pretty much everywhere except for Class Golf, and you do receive an instruction, then you do have to basically comply with that. This statement is just clarifying that an emergency situation allows deviation from an air traffic control clearance. And then, of course, part 3 is dealing with if you need to deviate due to an emergency, just notify air traffic control as soon as possible. Let them know what your intentions are. Maybe you were, going to be a head-on with either terrain, or maybe you're going to do a head-on with another pilot there, and you needed to deviate from whatever the information or the clearance was. Just let them know you're deviating right 10 degrees for whatever reason. Okay. And then finally, number 4, unless otherwise authorized by air traffic control, no person operating an aircraft may operate that aircraft according to any clearance or instruction that has been issued to another aircraft for basically the purposes of radar air control. So everybody here will be guilty of this. Every instructor has been guilty of this. Basically, it's pretty simple. If you, if your call sign is 1, 2, 3, 4, Papa, and you're only supposed to basically accept instructions for that call sign. If occasionally what you might hear is you might hear something like 1, 2, 3, 5 Papa might also be on the same frequency. And normally if it's a similar a similar sounding call sign, air traffic controllers will let you know that they are on the same frequency. So occasionally what ends up happening is you might hear, hey, Cessna 1235 Papa, go ahead and contact approach on 120.5, and you accidentally grab it. If you accidentally grab it and you don't really realize it right away and you check in, you can always just go back to your last frequency, let them know, hey, I think I accidentally grabbed this from the other airplane. Was that for Cessna 1234 Papa? And of course they're going to say no at that point. So it does happen. So just use caution if you're doing that. And if you're unsure if it is you, just go back to the controller and say, hey, Mr. or Mrs. Controller, whoever you're talking to, was that last call for 1234 Papa? And they'll let you know at that point. Aviate, navigate, communicate. Exactly. All right, 91-125. So very simply, in the event that your radios go out, we'll talk more about this in the near future, you still need a way to basically land safely at a towered airport. So in the event that obviously your radio goes out, you obviously do not assume that it's a radio failure right away. You want to check to make sure that maybe you fat-fingered in a frequency, maybe you wrote down the wrong frequency. Maybe you are not listening to the correct radio. Most aircraft have two radios. Maybe you're transmitting on radio 2, but you're trying to get a response on radio 1 and nobody's talking back to you. So just kind of do a little bit of troubleshooting. You can always try your other radio. You could try a handheld radio if you've got one. At the end of the day, if you basically lose your radios and you're going back into an uncontrolled airport, it's pretty simple. All you do is basically enter the traffic pattern and use caution, of course, and land, and that's it. If you're going back into a towered airport, what you would do is you would enter the traffic pattern 500 feet above everyone else, so that way you're not interfering with everybody. And very, very quickly, you're going to get these light signals from an air traffic controller in the tower. So it basically looks like these giant light guns. On a clear night, we tested these out in Camarillo, so I think we were able to see it 13 to 14 nautical miles away from the tower. And it's pretty simple. It's basically 3 different colors. It's either red, green, or white, and it's either going to be a steady color, basically a solid color, or it'll be flashing. So you do need to know each one of these as well, and very simply, here is what it looks like. I'll start off basically and go clockwise, starting with the white flashes. So if you receive white flashing lights, all you need to do is return to wherever you started on the airport, okay? If you receive a steady red, that means basically to stop and hold position wherever you are. If you receive a flashing red, then that means to basically get off the runway, move clear of the landing area. If you happen to be in the air and you receive the flashing red, then that means the airport is unsafe. Do not land at this airport and basically go somewhere else. You'll have to go to plan B at that case. If you receive a steady red, a solid red light, then what you're going to do is you're going to give way to other aircraft and continue circling. Just have an eyeball kind of glued to the tower, and you'll basically receive an additional light gun signal when they're ready to, return to the airport for either landing or actually clear you to land. If you receive, whether on the ground or in the air, a red and green alternating light, then it's pretty obvious. Just use extreme caution. Hopefully you're using extreme caution no matter what, just because you do not have a radio at this moment. If you receive a green flashing light while in the air, that means to return to the airport for landing. What we are looking for are steady green lights. So if you get a steady green light in the air, that's going to authorize you to land. And you're going to see this statement a lot. It's going to say if the pilot is satisfied that no collision risk exists. So normally the controller's doing that for you. So in this case, you are basically making sure that there's nothing, you're not going to hit anything, nobody's on the runway, and there is no collision risk for you to actually proceed and land. If you receive that steady green light while you're on the ground, that's actually going to authorize you to take off. And once again, it's if the pilot is satisfied, no collision risk exists. And then finally, you've got your green flashes. So if you have a green flashing light, that's going to authorize you to taxi if the pilot is once again satisfied that no collision risk exists. So very simply, you do need to know each one of these based upon if you're in the air or if you're on the ground. Unfortunately, I do not have any good acronyms for you guys for these. These are just ones that usually you put on a flashcard and you'll kind of commit them to memory. The reality is, though, is that for most of us, I'll go back one page here. I've got this, on my electronic flight bag. I've got this as a slide on my electronic flight bag. So the reality is in the event I did have a radio failure in flight, I would just reference this again. And I've actually had 3 radio failures in flight, unfortunately. So we'll talk more about the mechanics of actually what to do. This is just a regulation, but you also have a cell phone, most of you, and you can usually you can usually call the tower if you know the number. So I've done that before, going back into Camarillo, basically stating, hey, I'm the idiot that's circling you guys, or I'm inbound in about 5 minutes. I don't have a radio. Just want to give you guys a heads up. Here's my tail number. I'm going to be 3 minutes out, and I'm coming in from the west. Okay, so you can always do that as well. So feel free to take a screenshot of it. Unfortunately, there's not too many cheats with this. Next one we've got is basically our VFR fuel requirements. So this is 91-151. The one that you need to memorize here is just this. I include this image in just to kind of show you guys what some of the other requirements are for IFR. But what you do need to know is that at a minimum, you need to have enough fuel to get to wherever your destination is. And then if you're flying during the day, an additional 30 minutes of fuel. For nighttime, it's basically going to be enough fuel to get to whatever your intended destination is, and then an additional 45 minutes of fuel. Now keep in mind, these are your legal minimums. We're going to talk about something called personal minimums, which are usually going to be greater than the legal minimums. Some students that I know will say, I refuse to abide by that. I don't want anything less than an hour in my tanks when I land. And that's something that you could do. Okay. To put it into perspective for you, regardless if I'm flying VFR or IFR, the IFR one is always going to be more strict. So personally, I always go by the IFR minimums. You guys do not need to know this, but the IFR minimums are, you basically have enough fuel to get to wherever your first point of landing is, and then an alternate airport, and then an additional 45 minutes beyond that. So that way I've got more options. Keep in mind also that 30 minutes of fuel is not a lot of fuel for most of you. That could be somewhere between 3 to 6 gallons, depending on the aircraft that you guys are flying. And if you really are down to your last 30 minutes of fuel in the tank, most likely your fuel light's going to be on. And remember what we said about the fuel gauges and the lights. They're not very accurate. So it's kind of a best guess circumstance in these types of situations. But the ones that I highlighted, VFR, daytime flights, you need an additional 30 minutes of fuel. Nighttime VFR flights, an additional 45 minutes of fuel. So those are the 2 numbers you guys need to commit to memory. Okay. All right, 91-159. We're going to use this information quite a bit, what we just looked at with fuel, and also our cruising altitudes when we do our flight planning section in a couple weeks here. Anytime that we are basically flying for long periods of time, really anytime that we're flying above 3,000 feet AGL, we actually are going to be at specific altitudes, and those altitudes will either be an odd altitude, odd 1,000 plus 500 feet, or an even 1,000 plus 500 feet. And this is going to be based upon whatever our magnetic track direction is. So very simply, if you are flying on a magnetic heading of anywhere between 0 degrees and 179 degrees, you will be flying in odd thousands plus 500. The easy way to remember this, sorry for all of you East Coasters out there, but for the West Coasters, we think that people on the East Coast are very odd. Okay, so if you are going to the East Coast, you need to be at an odd 1,000 plus 500. Okay, so some examples there would be 3,500, 5,500, 7,500, 9,500, list goes on. Okay, if you are going westbound, anywhere between a magnetic track or a magnetic heading of 180 to 359, you will be at an even 1,000 plus 500, so 4,500, 6,500, 8,500, 10,500. Okay. And if you are going to basically be doing a bunch of zigzagging, so maybe you'll start part of the trip basically going over here, and then you're going to kind of backtrack over here, that's where you would actually select a different altitude. So for example, if I'm going basically kind of northwestbound, I might choose 4,500 feet. And then as soon as I change directions, then I might need to either go up to 5,500 feet or I might need to go down to 3,500, depending on the direction and what altitude suits me best. Okay. Yes, west is even odder, I know. But easy way to remember, if you're heading east, East Coasters are odd. So if you're eastbound, it's going to be an odd 1,000 plus 500 feet. Okay. So you do have traffic kind of split in between you. So just remember that choose the altitude that's most appropriate. We'll talk more about altitude selection when we get into flight planning. And a lot of times, sometimes, at the end of the day, altitude is your friend. 91203 is, you'll notice a couple abbreviations. AC is aircraft for short. So these are your civil aircraft certifications. This is an acronym that we use. It's called AERO. So you'd want to write this one down. These are things that have to be on board the aircraft anytime that you want to fly. So if any of these are missing, then the aircraft is not going to be deemed airworthy, and you're basically grounded until you get the documents. So the first one is the Airworthiness Certificate. We talked about that a couple days ago on Monday. It's basically a document. It's very much or very similar to the birth certificate of an airplane. So when it rolls off the factory line, it will have a date of issuance and someone who signs it from the FAA. It never expires. It does have to be visible. A lot of times in Pipers, they're kept in the baggage compartment. In most other planes, they're usually kept by the left or right calf on the pilot side in a little plastic sleeve so you can see those. But it never expires. And the other thing that's important here is it does not imply that the airplane is airworthy. Okay, so there's a couple of things we need to do for that. Next one that we have is going to be your registration. So just like a car, we have to register an aircraft, pay our $5 every 3 years. It is valid for 3 years, and very simply, it'll have the name of the owner or the flight school on it. If you flip it over, there's about 5 or 6 reasons why a registration could become void. So some of the biggest and obvious ones is if you destroy the airplane, then it becomes void. If you sell the airplane to a new owner, then the registration becomes void. If the original owner loses their citizenship or transfers the ownership to some other, changes the tail number, if you will, to a non-N number, then that will also void the registration as well. So a couple examples there. The radio operator's license is only going to be applicable in the event you're flying outside of the United States. Most airplanes do not have a radio operator's license. But anytime you're flying anywhere outside the United States, including Canada, Mexico, and the Caribbean, you would need that radio operator's license. The O is your operating limitations, and it's actually made up of these 3 things. So it's our pilot's operating handbook or approved flight manual. Kind of looks just like this. It always has to be on board the aircraft, and it is very specific to that aircraft. A lot of times what will end up happening is they will have, let's say, the registration or the serial number, and if you were to open up the door of your airplane, you'll actually see kind of in the door frame there that you'll see the original serial number, whatever the manufacturer printed. It usually matches the manual. The second thing is all of your instrument markings, so all those color codings on your airspeed indicator, your oil temperatures, your fuel gauges, all those we have to comply with. Then the third one is all of our placards, so the no smoking sign, the fuel requirements, our maneuvering speeds, no spins in aircrafts, those types of things also apply. Then finally, it is going to be our weight and balance. The weight and balance is the official weight and balance, which is computed by a mechanic. It basically includes our basic empty weight, and then it includes any of, basically our basic empty weight, which is our starting point. It also gives us our CG. And then from there, what we do with that as pilots is we basically load up the airplane, and then we can kind of figure out where can we put different weight and different people. So we always need things to balance, and it always needs to be with what is called a CG envelope. We'll talk more about that when we get to the weight and balance section as we move forward. All right, the next one we have is 91207. This is your ELT, also known as Emergency Locator Transmitter. It's basically a big plastic box, and really what the whole point of it is that in the event you got into a collision or accident or had any type of major contact with the ground or something else, it will automatically turn on and actually start doing its thing. Now, for the purposes of the ELT, it has to be inspected every 12 calendar months. And what they're doing is they're inspecting it for installation, operation, battery corrosion, and for basically the presence of a sufficient signal that's radiated from its antenna. These will usually be transmitted at least at a minimum on our emergency frequency, which is known as guard frequency on 121.5. And then some of the newer ones are also on the 407 frequency as well. So if you want to test the ELT, you can do so only during the first 5 minutes of the hour, and you're only allowed 3 sweeps with it. So if you had a handheld radio, or if you're using the radio in the airplane, you could actually turn this guy on, and you'll actually hear the pings every single time that it passes. The other thing you also need to do is within this device, there is some batteries, and you have to replace the batteries at half of its useful life, 50% of its useful life, or if you've used the device for 1 cumulative hour of use. Okay, so there is usually no, there's no like Hobbs meter or anything that tells you how many hours you've used it. So if you think you used it for a significant or sufficient amount of time, you'd probably want to replace it anyway. So this is all basically recorded in an aircraft book, and then we know exactly, the battery came out, let's say or it's basically going to expire in, let's say, 2031. So 50% of that would be that we would replace it basically in 5 years from now, which would be 2026. Okay. Aircraft lights is 91209. Okay, so 91209. And remember that this is the official nighttime for airplanes, is going to be considered from sunset to sunrise. So very simply, from sunset to sunrise, you have to have your position lights on. So we can clearly see here, they're usually going to be located on the pilot side. We've got the red light. There is a green light on the co-pilot side or passenger side. And in the very, very back here that we can't see, there's usually going to be a white light. So position lights always have to be on from basically sunset to sunrise. Your anti-collision lights always have to be on regardless of the time of day. Anytime the airplane is basically powered on or is in operation. So traditionally, when we turn the battery master on, when we get into the airplane, the rotating beacon or the anti-collision light is really the first light that's going to be on. And that's going to warn people that, hey, this airplane is about to start up, or it's currently in operation, meaning the engine is currently spinning. Okay, so depends on the aircraft that you fly. For the most part, the anti-collision lights are traditionally in the Cessnas. They're usually going to be like a red light at the very top. Some of the other planes, they might have one on the bottom as well. In some Pipers I've seen, there are actually strobe lights on basically the wing tips that basically flash consistently. So you're going to have to figure out, depending on your aircraft, what is going to be considered your basically anti-collision lights as you guys are flying. Okay, that always needs to be in operation. Now, in the event that for whatever reason you deem that it's hazardous to have those anti-collision lights on, as the pilot in command, you do have the discretion to turn them off in the event you do find it distracting. So there was a Piper that I used to fly, and the anti-collision lights were right here on the end. And very simply, it was a very, very bright strobe as the anti-collision light. And it's very, very blinding at night as a pilot. So a lot of times we would turn those off, and then after we departed from the airport, we'd turn them on when it was a bit safer to do so. Plus, we're not blinding everybody, all the pilots taxiing around in and around the airport as well. Okay. All right, 91211 is your supplemental oxygen. There's 3 requirements that we need to kind of keep in mind here. And with these are specifically dealing with basically unpressurized aircraft. Pretty much everybody here, I would say about 100% of you in this class, are going to be flying an unpressurized aircraft. And there's 2, the requirements are going to deal with either flight crew, so that would be you, the pilot, or potentially your instructor, and then any passengers you're carrying as well. So very simply, from until you get to 12,500 feet, there's really no requirements for any type of supplemental oxygen that needs to be used. Once you get above 12,500 feet, but you're basically within 12,500 and still below 14,000 in this area, you can stay at any one of those altitudes up to 30 minutes. As soon as 30 minutes is elapsed and you're above 12,500 feet, then you need to basically utilize supplemental oxygen. Okay. The other thing you could do is if you want to stay up there for 20 minutes and then basically go back down, that would obviously, that would preclude you. You wouldn't actually have to participate with using supplemental oxygen. If you climb to 14,000 feet, at or above 14,000 feet, then all crew members are required to be on oxygen instantaneously. There really is no waiting period at that point. Once we get to 15,000 feet, we're super duper nice with our passengers, and they have the ability to utilize supplemental oxygen. So we basically offer it to them, and it's up to them if they want to use it or not. But we're not required to provide it until we get to 15,000 feet. Now, keep in mind, these are your legal oxygen requirements. There are some recommendations from the FAA as well. So their recommendations are very simple. If you're flying anytime during the day, anytime you're above 10,000 feet, 10,000 feet, they recommend using supplemental oxygen. And at night, it's 5,000 feet. Really, the reason being is at night, the first thing that goes is going to be your vision. And remember also that everybody has different, everybody kind of gets affected by hypoxia slightly different. I've had a student pass out a long time ago at like 11,500 or 12,000 feet, so we're well below the oxygen requirement. Some people do fine, up to 13 or 14,000 feet. Some people start feeling it around 9,000 feet. So if you have the opportunity, once COVID is done and the FAA basically starts redoing their hyperbaric chamber, their what is it called? The altitude chamber, whatever that thing is called. You guys can always participate in that. I think there's a nominal fee, and what they'll do is they'll have you basically work on puzzles and do like word association games, and they'll actually start jacking up the altitude to kind of see how it affects you personally. So there's a couple of them. There's one in Oklahoma, and they usually have a couple roaming around the country in non-COVID times as well. Okay. All right, your transponder requirements is 91125. We're not going to talk about how a transponder operates. We'll get into that a little bit later today, but for this is just the regulation. I'm going to show you guys an easier chart to memorize this rather than just kind of looking at the words. A lot of people get confused with that. And then the other thing that someone was asking the other day is ADSB. You do have an ADSB requirement as well, which is your automatic dependent surveillance broadcast. And we'll talk more about the mechanics of that system when we come back from the break. But for the moment right now, what I want to do is I want to show you guys a chart, and I want to show you guys exactly where you're required to have a transponder and an ADSB. They are kind of two separate systems. So the most basic transponder, by the way, is just going to provide your location to air traffic control, and a Mode C transponder, or what we call an altitude encoding transponder, is going to show not only your position but also your altitude. As of January of last year, it was a requirement to have ADSB installed in certain locations depending on where you flew. Now, what I'm going to show you guys is that even though this slide says ADSB, they pretty much align in terms of your ADSB requirements and your transponder requirements. So let's look at them side by side. So very simply, for both an ADSB and a transponder, anytime that you're operating in Class Alpha airspace, you're required to have an ADSB and a transponder. Simple as that, which is basically going to be from 18,000 to flight level 600. Anytime that you're operating in Class Echo airspace above 10,000 feet, ADSB is required and also a transponder, except for the space 2,500 feet AGL. It's not required for ADSB or the transponder. Anytime that you're operating in a Class Bravo airspace, both an ADSB and your transponder are required from surface to 10,000 feet. Anytime that you're operating in a Mode C Vail, both your ADSB and a transponder is required from surface to 10,000 feet on a 30 nautical mile radius that surrounds your Class Bravo airport. For your Class Charlie airports, from the surface up to whatever the top of the Class Charlie is and the space above it, basically anything above the Class Charlie, both an ADSB and a transponder is required. So basically surface to 10,000 feet. And then finally, the only difference between your ADSB requirement and also your transponder requirement is this one right here. And this only applies over the Gulf of Mexico. So if you're operating inside of a Class Echo airspace, an ADSB is required from 3,000 to 10,000 feet MSL, 12 nautical miles off the coastline, only in the Gulf of Mexico. It does not apply over the Pacific or the Atlantic coastlines, and that is the only difference where ADSB is required but no transponder is required. The reason being is we have all of those oil platforms and oil rigs out there, and there are a ton of flights coming in and out of that general area that are going to those refineries. So it basically provides more eyes in the sky, and in the sense that it's just going to provide a faster refresh rate than the standard traditional radar equipment that basically uses a sweeping system to pick up an aircraft. Okay. I'll show you guys a video of how ADSB works and why it's going to be better, and why it's basically used. That's basically replacing the transponder. And it's not really replacing the transponder. They're essentially one and the same. But I think this slide does it a little bit better justice in the sense that they are literally side by side, the exact same requirements except for that Gulf of Mexico. Now, anytime that you're flying elsewhere, so let's assume that you're flying over here by this mountain and you're flying in Class Echo airspace or Class Gulf airspace, it's not going to be required that you have either an ADSB or a transponder altogether. Okay, so with that, let's do this. Let's go ahead and take our 10-minute break. When we come back, I've got a couple of FAA test questions that are going to revolve around this slide, so I'll let you guys study it for the next 10 minutes. But other than that, go ahead and stretch your legs, grab a bite to eat if you need it, grab something to drink, recaffeinate, rebourbonate, rebeerinate, whatever your beverage of choice is, and we will see everybody back here in 10. All right, everybody, welcome back from break, and just to answer a couple questions here. So yes, that is the ADSB chart. It's just a little easier to use just because it's literally the same requirements as a transponder, except for that Class Echo airspace that you guys see over on the left-hand side there, which is over the Gulf of Mexico. That's the only difference between ADSB and your transponder locations. Other than that, let me just see. I think there was one other thing that I wanted to say to you guys real quick here, and I do have an FAA test question. For the individual that sent in their information to Travis, I believe it was, we're going to send that out. So Natasha, sorry, I was trying to read 6 different notes here. Natasha, I'll send out your Rod Machado book that you basically won in the giveaway. I'll do that first thing tomorrow. Everybody else has stuff sent out, and then we just need Robert to reconfirm his email address or his mailing address, then we'll be set. All right, so with this, the poll is open. Here is your FAA test question. In the 48 contiguous states, excluding the airspace at or below 2,500 feet AGL, an operable coded transponder equipped with Mode C capability is required in all controlled airspace at and above. Is it A, 12,500 feet MSL, 10,000 feet MSL, or flight level 180? Douglas, we'll get to speed. It's actually the next slide. Occasionally I move things around depending on the class that we're dealing with. So we still have aircraft speeds coming up. You're welcome, Natasha. All right, got the first third of folks in. All right, there's about 50%. Here's about 80%, just waiting for a few stragglers here. All right, let's take a look at it. Apologize if I cut anybody off there. We got about 19% with A, majority of the class 72, a little over 72% with B, and 8% with C. So keep in mind, you can pretty much get rid of some of this stuff, excluding the airspace at or below 2,500 feet. When do you need a Mode C transponder within controlled airspace? Very simply, it will be B. It's anytime you're above 10,000 feet, and that does also include Class Alpha airspace as well. So, I mean, that is inclusive of 18,000 going all the way up to 60,000, but it does start at 10,000. The reason why 12,500 is not any type of airspace that an altitude that defines any type of airspace. So that is also the reason why it is incorrect. Okay. Let's see here. All right. So let's take a look at aircraft speeds. Flight level 180 is Class Alpha airspace. So Class Alpha airspace, you're required to have a transponder anyways, but it's asking, question is asking it slightly different. So if anybody wants to look at that again, it's saying excluding the airspace at or below 2,500 feet AGL, the operable coded transponder equipped with Mode C, which is that altitude encoding, it's going to be from 10,000 feet and above. Okay, so that's what the question is looking for. But flight level 180 is 18,000 feet. Thanks, Douglas. All right, so going back just a step here, this is FAR 91117, which is your aircraft speed limits, and it's going to be dependent upon what altitude you're actually flying in, and then of course what airspace you're actually flying in as well. So very simply, anytime that you are above 10,000 feet, I don't really like to say this, but the books always tell you this, it's going to say no speed limit. The reality is that there is a more obscure FAR out there as well. So there is technically a speed limit, and the speed limit is anything below the speed of sound. So basically no sonic booms are allowed. But don't worry, your Cessnas and Pipers are never going to get up to that speed anyways. So generally, we usually say there is no speed limit. Anytime that you're below 10,000 feet, your speed limit is going to be 250 knots. And keep in mind, all of these speeds are going to be indicated. It's not based on true airspeed, ground speed, or anything else in between. It's whatever you see on the face of your airspeed indicator. It's your indicated airspeed. If you're flying within Class Bravo airspace, it's also 250 knots. And if you're going to be flying, if you're going to basically be flying below a Class Bravo, meaning right below a shelf of a Class Bravo, or through one of those VFR corridors through a Class Bravo, it will be 200 knots, or as specified, at least for special flight rules situations. The final one that we have is if you're flying within Class Charlie or Delta airspace, keep in mind that it's this specific requirement. No person may operate an aircraft at or below 2,500 feet above the surface within 4 nautical miles of the primary airport in Class Charlie or Class Delta airspace at an indicated airspeed of more than 200 knots. Okay, so what most people get wrong on this, though, is that if we kind of go back to the dimensions, so for the most part, here's the dimensions of a Class Delta airspace. Remember, it's roughly about 4 nautical miles. And it's generally going to be from the surface up to 2,500 feet AGL. So that's basically telling you that in a Class Delta, no matter what in a Class Delta, it's pretty much always going to be 200 knots max. Class Charlies are a little bit different, though, because they have multi-tiers. So remember that we basically have that inner tier right here, which is by that airport. So that's kind of here. And then we kind of have that upside down wedding cake look as well. And really the top is supposed to be 4,000 feet AGL within a Class Charlie. So when we're looking at a Class Charlie, it's basically going to be a smaller area. Basically, it's only going to be up to 2,500 feet high. So if I were to kind of shade in this center portion, you'll notice that it does not include the entire shape of, or the entire area of Class Charlie. It's basically just from 2,500 feet above the surface and 4 nautical miles from whatever the primary airport is in Class Charlie. So a lot of people think that all of Class Charlie is included within that, but reading the regulation, it's a little bit more limited than that if you were to kind of draw it out. Okay. All right, the next one that we've got is going to be your 91303 for aerobatic flight. Just keep in mind that you cannot conduct any type of aerobatic flight over congested area of a city, town, or settlement. The other thing you can't do is you cannot do it over an open air assemblies of persons or when less than 1,500 feet above the surface, or if we have flight visibility that is less than 3 statute miles. So a lot of people are going to ask, how do they do these at airports and those types of things? They get waivers that basically bypass some of these rules. So they're very specific that they can request from the FAA. You're also not allowed to conduct aerobatic flight within the lateral boundaries of the surface areas of Class Bravo, Charlie, Delta, or Echo airspace designated for an airport. And then you also obviously want to stay away from any federal airways. Those are kind of like highways in the sky. So traditionally, federal airways, you got a lot of aircraft going back and forth. So they do not want you doing loops and rolls kind of within that congested or more congested part of the sky. The other thing I'll also say with this is that just because you're getting in an airplane, not every airplane is capable of aerobatic flight. And if you are interested in aerobatic flight, just make sure you go up with someone who is sufficiently trained as an instructor within those areas. It's kind of a unique training in itself. 91307, we kind of talked about this previously, dealing with parachutes, but very simply, if you intentionally if you basically bring the nose up or down, at least pitch it up or down more than 30 degrees of pitch, or if you intentionally bank the airplane right or left greater than 60 degrees of bank, then each occupant that is going to be inside that aircraft has to basically be wearing an approved parachute. Okay, so that's really the rule with the parachutes there. All right, maintenance requirements. So 91407. This is basically operations after maintenance, preventative maintenance, and then rebuilding or alterations. So this regulation is basically going to state that no person may operate an aircraft that has undergone any type of maintenance, preventative maintenance, rebuilding, or any of those other things we just talked about, unless you get what is known as a return to service by a qualified mechanic inside the logbooks. So just like you have a logbook as a pilot, recording all of your hours and everything else, the airplanes generally have 3 sets of logbooks. There's usually one for the airframe, then you have one for the power plant, which is the engine, and then there's usually another one for the prop as well. So depending on the type of aircraft, some of these can get fairly lengthy, and some of the older aircraft will have multiple versions, I guess, or copies of the logbooks. Part 43 of the Federal Aviation Regulations, which is really dealing with maintenance type things, basically allows the owner of an aircraft to do specific maintenance tasks. Keep in mind that you do need to have at least a private pilot license or higher. Student pilots cannot sign off on this type of work. But this also does not mean that you can do major overhauls. You can't take the wings off or repair, major things. You can't just replace an engine. That's not going to be considered, preventative maintenance. Where we can find the full list of preventative maintenance, you could look at 91407. This is not an all exhaustive list, but if you guys actually go to the regulation 407, you'll see even more things. But very simply, preventative maintenance could be the following. And once again, it can't be a student pilot, but a private pilot or higher can do the following things. So changing spark plugs, basically changing or replenishing the hydraulic fluid in the brake lines. That also includes basically changing the brake calipers, servicing the landing gears, the wheels, the bearings, changing them, changing the tires as well. Doing oil changes also applies. Cleaning out or replacing air filters, replacing any one of the hoses that are in there as well. Those are all going to be preventative maintenance. At the end of the day, if you are doing the preventative maintenance on your airplane, you will need to basically make an entry into the logbook. You're basically going to do a quick narrative of whatever you accomplished. You change the oil with 100 weight oil, and you put in 12 quarts, whatever you ended up doing. Change the oil filter, sign it, put in your certificate number. So for you, that will be your pilot's number, and then the type of certificate that you held. So probably it'll be like private pilot, whatever the number is, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then just the description that goes with it. Then what we've got is 409 is your aircraft inspection. So there's actually 2 different types of inspections that you're going to see. The annual inspection is due annually. It's due every 12 calendar months. And no matter what, an annual needs to be done. Every single airplane that is flying has an annual that has basically been performed on it. And the annual is exactly the same inspection that would actually happen at the 100-hour inspection as well. Okay. The 2 biggest differences between the annual and the 100-hour is that the annual has to be done by someone who is certified. Basically, we call it an A&P, IA. So the A&P is an airframe and power plant mechanic. The IA is the important part, and they basically have inspection authorization. And effectively, they've undergone additional training. They've taken some additional tests. I think, don't hold me to it, some A&P can correct me. I thought it was like 5 years of experience as a basic A&P. And then once they have that, they basically get these magical letters after their A&P license, and they can basically certify things on behalf of the FAA. And one of the things they're usually certifying is the annual inspection. So every airplane needs to have an annual. In the event that 12 calendar months comes and goes and an annual is not, performed, that airplane is effectively grounded until it is performed. Now, there's one way to get the airplane in the air, and it's really just in pursuit of maintenance. So the one way that we can get that airplane in the air is basically by requesting a special ferry permit, and we can actually get that or make that request directly with the FAA local office, which is actually known as the FSDO, which is the Flight Safety District Office. Okay, so that is basically a one-time permit that allows just one individual, no passengers, to do a daytime VFR flight to a maintenance facility on a specific day. So if you don't accomplish the flight on that day that ferry permit is given, then you're going to have to go back to the office and actually request another one. The 100-hour inspection is the exact same inspection as the annual, except a basic A&P, an airframe and power plant mechanic can do it. They do not need to have the IA status with that. And a 100-hour inspection is due every 100 hours, and it's not 100 hours of Hobbs time, it's 100 hours of tack time, it's 100 hours actually on the engine. So if you are carrying any person other than a crew member for hire, or if you're giving flight instruction for hire in an aircraft, that aircraft must have an inspection within the preceding 100 hours of time in service. Okay, so the 100 hours is a little bit more lenient. So once you get to 100 hours, you have up to an additional 10 hours only in pursuit of maintenance. So very simply, if we bought our airplane at a flight school with 0 hours, and let's assume that we get to the airplane and we've got 99.9 hours, and you're going to do an instructional flight. You've got your CFI with you. Theoretically, you cannot take off and do a 2-hour lesson. The rule is not designed so you can take off with 0.1 left. You could basically turn on the engine, get it to 100, and then turn it back off. Okay. Really, anything beyond 100 hours is really for the purpose of in pursuit of maintenance. So maybe you're at a more remote area of the country, and your airport does not have a mechanic there. So you actually need to fly it to that mechanic. So, and the example I'll give you here is it's due at 100 hours. Okay. And you basically fly it you can fly up to 10 hours in pursuit of maintenance. So let's assume you get it to the mechanic at 110 hours. Okay. Well, the question is going to be when is the next 100-hour due? And it's normally due every 100 hours. And that's still going to be the case. It's still going to be due at 200 hours. If you fly any hours beyond the 100-hour, you're basically eating into the next time frame. So if you get your inspection done at 110 hours, that's only going to leave you 90 hours until your next 100-hour is due. This applies also if you do own your own airplane and you are using it for instruction. After 100 hours, you will need that 100-hour inspection as well. Okay. So most likely you're going to see these for flight instruction. Now keep in mind that if you go to a flight school, a lot of times you'll be able to fly an aircraft that is beyond its 100-hour, assuming you do not have an instructor on board. So let's say that you're working on your solo flight hours, right? Solo flight hours is not going to be, you're not receiving flight instruction for hire at that point, nor are you for hire. So you could actually fly it beyond the 100-hour, assuming that there's no airworthiness directives that apply. Okay, the 100-hour is primarily only going to be required if you're basically flying for hire or compensation, or it's for basically flight instruction. Okay. All right, 91413 is your transponder inspection. So your transponder, just like anything else, needs to be inspected every 24 calendar months. And then they're going to basically put in the maintenance record, usually in your airframe log, the description of the work, and someone will sign off on it, and then it will be good for another 2 years there. Your maintenance records, 91417 as well as your maintenance records. So these are going to have all of your records for the annual inspections, the 100-hour inspections, major alterations, repairs, anything that's minor, and also any other required maintenance. And then any type of frequent and additional inspections that may be performed on the aircraft, also known as airworthiness directives, will also be within these documents. Most of these times, actually every time I've seen these, they're usually kept in a safe. Really the value of your aircraft is really tied up into these records, so they don't want them to disappear for a student to grab hold of them. You do always have the opportunity, and you will be expected on your check ride to pull out the official maintenance records and basically demonstrate that all of the required inspections that we've talked about thus far have been completed, so that way the examiner knows that you know how to check this information as well. All right. Let's go ahead and take a look at kind of your documents and inspections kind of in a nutshell. If you guys want to take a screenshot of this, I'd recommend it. All right, so with that, here is kind of what we talked about. So everything on the left-hand side is all of your required documents. This is your AERO acronym that we talked about previous to this, the airworthiness certificate, all the way down to your weight and balance. And anytime they go out to an airplane, these are part of the things that you are checking to basically verify that the airplane is airworthy. Okay. On the right-hand side, this is your required inspection. So you have an annual inspection that we talked about, which is every 12 calendar months. Now this one is going to be, got to put a couple underlines in there. It's usually going to be AVIATED way that we remember this. And the I in this is actually a 1 for the 100 hour. Okay, so we've got the annual inspection. The reason why we keep the VOR in here is that it makes sense for the aviated. The one on the left is aero, so you guys want to kind of memorize these. The VOR inspection is only required every 30 days in the event you're flying IFR, so that will be more of something you'd look at once you become an instrument-rated pilot, but for the moment, it's not required. The 100-hour inspection for hire or for flight instruction. The altimeter pedostatic system, this is the other one that we need to talk about, which is this. This is only required every 24 calendar months in the event that you are flying under an instrument flight rules on an instrument flight plan within controlled airspace. I think it's 91411 is the code there if you want to look that up. So 91411. And for the most part, pretty much any airplane that's out of flight school will have an altimeter pedostatic system check, just because they're not limiting that aircraft just to go out for private pilots. We have a range of pilots that are flying at both VFR and IFR. Your transponder every 24 calendar months, and then your ELT every 12 calendar months. Plus, you also need to replace the battery at 50% of its useful life, or 1 hour of cumulative use. Okay, so 1 hour of use. And then finally is your ADs. So these are called airworthiness directives. Airworthiness directives are basically things that we have to comply with. They're regulatory in nature. They're not optional. They're 100% mandatory. And there's actually two different types of airworthiness directives. The first one is called a one-time, and the second one is called a reoccurring. Okay, so very simply, a one-time might be that something came up after this thing was actually built. And the FAA needs you to inspect whatever it might be, or replace a part if that's what's necessary. So we saw these with the emergency airworthiness directives that came out with the Boeing 737 MAXs after those two tragic accidents that we had about almost 2 years ago now. And basically that grounded the fleet until they came up with some type of actions that the carriers could take and the mechanics could take to actually inspect these devices, or for the manufacturer to actually create a fix for it. Other times, they're going to be one time in the sense that it may tell you to do it immediately. You cannot take this airplane off or utilize this airplane until you check something or replace something. Or it might say that you need to check or replace something during the next annual, the next 100 hour, or it might say that you need to check something every 5,000 hours. Just depends on how it's written. The airworthiness directives, any of the new airworthiness directives get sent directly to the registered owner of the airplane. So that's the reason why we register the airplane as well. And then the second type is called a reoccurring. So very simply, the easiest one I can kind of give you is on some of those older Cessnas. If you were to take the seats off, there's basically these things called seat rails, and they have little holes in them, just like this, where basically the seat position locks into. Those older Cessnas from the 50s, 60s, and some of them from the 70s as well, the seat rails and the actual locking mechanism did not lock in place. So what ended up happening is there was numerous accidents and incidents where people would take off and their seat would get pushed all the way to the very furthest or farthest position back, and they basically could not reach the controls, and they had kind of a loss of control of the aircraft. On the flip side, people were coming into landing and the seat would not lock in place, and they would slide all the way forward to the firewall, and they basically would not have any type of control because they're sitting too close to the actual controls themselves. And for that purpose, there actually is a reoccurring on some of the Cessnas out there. So every 100 hours, regardless of the type of aircraft, whether it's for hire, flight instruction, or if it's just personal use, you're basically going to take off the seats and inspect the seat rails themselves, make sure the locking mechanisms work, and that's what we would call a reoccurring airworthiness directive. So keep in mind, they are going to be mandatory, and you do have to comply with them in order to get up in the air. If you haven't complied with it, that airplane is basically effectively grounded until whatever the airworthiness directive is telling you to do is basically completed. Okay. All right. So this is your last question dealing with federal aviation regulations here. So with that, let's go ahead and take a look at it. What should an owner or operator know about airworthiness directives, ADs? Is it A, they are for informational purposes only, B, they are mandatory, or C, they are voluntary? got about 50% of the class in so far, and we're going to move on to our NTSB stuff. And like I said before, whatever we don't finish today, we will basically pick up on Friday. And as of this Friday, we will be officially caught up with everything that we need to cover. So, all right, about 80% in, just waiting for those stragglers out there. One should be pretty easy, looking for 100% or as close to that number as we can get. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at it. We've got about 2% with a couple people on C, but the majority of the class has the correct answer. ADs are 100% mandatory. They have to be complied with. That airplane is effectively grounded unless that airplane has an AD that has been complied with, okay? All right, moving on. The next thing that we're going to talk about is going to be your NTSB regulations. Now, the NTSB regulations are basically, we call these NTSB Part 830. They are slightly different than your federal aviation regulations, and these are going to be dealing with any type of accident, incident, and your reporting responsibilities. So hopefully, at the end of the day, nobody ever has to actually utilize this other than just kind of memorizing a couple components for the purposes of your written exam. Now, if you do have the FAR AIM that I showed you guys the other day, pretty much every FAR AIM, all the publishers do include the NTSB Part 830 requirements in there as well, usually as a chapter, just because it's fairly pertinent to you being a pilot, okay? So with that, let's go ahead and take a look at a few things. First things that we need to look at are actually some basic definitions. The first one is going to be your definitions of what the NTSB deems a serious injury. So not everything is going to be considered serious, even though some other people might think it would be. So these are the 5 circumstances which would be considered a serious injury. So anything that requires hospitalization for greater than 48 hours or for more than 48 hours, commencing within 7 days from the date the injury was received. Anything that resulted in a fracture of a bone, except for any type of simple fractures of the fingers, toes, or nose. Anything that causes severe hemorrhaging, which is bleeding, nerve, muscle, or tendon damage. Anything that involves any type of internal organ, and then involves 2nd or 3rd degree burns or any burns affecting greater than 5% of the body's surface. Some other definitions that we need to know as well is going to be dealing with substantial damage. So here we obviously can see substantial damage. This is an airplane that probably experienced quite a bit of hail, whether they're flying through a cell or nearby. But substantial damage is damage that is basically defined, let's say it this way, it's defined as damage or failure which adversely affects the structural strength, performance, or flight characteristics of an aircraft and which would normally require major repair or replacement of the affected components. So that is everything except for the following 3. So these 3 do not apply. Engine failure or damage that's limited to an engine if only one engine fails or is damaged. So basically, if you have two engines or a multi-engine aircraft, if only one failed, that's not considered as substantial damage. Bent fairings or cowling, dented skin, small puncture holes in the skin or fabric are also not considered. And then ground damage to rotor or prop blades and damage to landing gear, wheels, tires, flaps, engine accessory, brakes, or wingtips are also not going to be deemed substantial damage. Now there is, I believe, 8 different circumstances in which you are required to make an immediate notification. And we'll talk more about what immediate notification means here in a second, but here they are. The first one is any type of flight control system malfunction or failure. So obviously if if your ailerons, your elevator, any of these major systems failed, those are all considered flight control systems. Inability of any required flight crew member to perform his or her normal flight duties as a result of injury or illness. Failure of structural components of a turbine engine, excluding compressor or turbine blades or vanes, won't really apply to you guys here. In-flight fire, any type of collision in flight. This one you guys will see as an FAA test question, and it's important to kind of know this number right here. So damage to property other than the aircraft, with it has to have an estimated, the estimate has to basically exceed $25,000 for repair or fair market value in the event of total loss. So in this example here, if you decide to accidentally taxi and clip the corner of a building, maybe a large hangar like this, and that corner happened to be a load-bearing wall, and the rest of the hangar dropped on all these wonderful aircraft out here, any time that it exceeds $25,000, then that would be an immediate notification. If it's $24,000 of damage, then it's not an immediate notification. So the threshold here is $25,000, and it also does not include any damage for your airplane, but any other property damage or other aircraft damage, then it is included. All right, the last two that we have would be a release of all or portion of a prop blade, propeller blade from an aircraft, excluding releases caused solely by ground contact. There's a cool video on YouTube where this guy, I think it's an experimental or home built, and he's flying along, and the next thing you know is he loses his prop blade. It just completely flies off. Makes a very good and safe emergency landing without the prop, so it does a nice job gliding it back in. But if you lose the blade, for whatever reason, it separates from your aircraft, then that is an immediate notification. The last one here, number 8, is going to be a complete loss of information, excluding flickering from more than 50% of your aircraft's cockpit displays. So whether that's your primary flight display, your primary navigation display, your electronic flight information display known as an EFIS, or anything else like a multifunction display. Very simply, for those in the G1000, you're pretty much only having 2 screens. You've got your primary flight display known as your PFD, and you've got an MFD, which is your multifunction display. Effectively, if you lose one of those screens, then you'll have to make this notification as well. All right, NTSB 830.1 is dealing with any type of wreckage and mail, cargo, and records. What are kind of your responsibilities? So if you're the operator of an aircraft that's involved in an accident or incident, it's actually your job to protect the wreckage and everything associated with that wreckage until the NTSB arrives and then assumes responsibility of the scene. So keep in mind, obviously, rescue passengers and crew. Make sure everybody gets a safe enough distance away from whatever that is, and deal with any hazards as they come up. And then from that point, then it's going to be just try to protect the wreckage from any further damage, and also protect it from any public as well. So prevent from anybody else from getting injured with it. If you need to move wreckage, remember to make a note of it, take a photo of it, draw a sketch of it, whatever the original condition is. But basically, it's a federal crime if anyone was to take a part of that wreckage as a souvenir. A couple of people back 2010s-ish during the unfortunate space shuttle re-entry where it broke up over Texas. There's a couple of people that decided to take souvenirs from that accident. They were actually punished under that NTSB rule there. NTSB 830.15. So this is basically, your requirements in terms of when you need to report it. And these are the numbers that we need to kind of memorize here. So an operator of an aircraft must file a report within 10 days after an accident, or after 7 days if an overdue aircraft is still missing. A report on an incident for which immediate notification is required. So all those things I just told you, the in-flight fire, the $25,000 of damage or greater, in-flight collisions, any of these things, that's all 8 of those were considered immediate notifications. Keep in mind, just the wording is a little bit tricky here. A report on an incident for which immediate notification is required shall be filed, okay? Shall be filed only as requested by an authorized representative of the board, okay? Basically the NTSB. Keep in mind, this is the magic word, only if requested. So it's not necessarily a guarantee, but I would also encourage you, if you ended up in an accident or incident, just call the NTSB. If you go to the phone book or basically Google their number, they have a duty officer that is there 24 hours a day taking calls. You can let them know what happened, and then they can determine if they need to, it's kind of like CYA in this case, right? So they can determine if it is going to be something that's immediate, or if they want to report at that given moment as well. Okay. All right. 2 questions, and then we're moving on to your inoperative equipment. Which incident would necessitate an immediate notification to the nearest NTSB field office? Is it A, an in-flight generator alternator failure, B, an in-flight fire, or C, an in-flight loss of VOR receiver capability? Got the first third in so far. Sorry, LB, if you fat fingered it, just make a mental note. Right, we're about 80%. About 90%. Looking good on the answers, though. Looking for 100% if we can get it. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at it. Sorry if I cut off anyone. We've got 2% with A, 87% majority of the class with B, and 9% with C. And the majority does have it. So anything that's really dealing with an immediate notification is really the most serious out of the list. An in-flight generator or alternator failure, if you lose power, that's not really a major issue. Same thing with in-flight loss of VOR receiver. A VOR is not actually a requirement that you have one on board, so it's not even a required piece of equipment. But the most serious issue would obviously be an in-flight fire occurs. Okay, so for anybody that fat fingered it, here is another opportunity with a different question. So let's take a look at this. The operator of an aircraft that has been involved in an incident is required to submit a report to the nearest field office of the NTSB. Is it within 7 days, 10 days, or when requested? Think about what we highlighted and circled there. Douglas, if you're cutting out, I know that the forward and previous buttons are on the website. Are you talking about the on the mobile app? It doesn't allow you to fast forward. For those that need to bow out at the top of the hour here, remember you guys can catch the recording basically either later tonight or tomorrow if you guys can't sleep. Have a good one, patience. All right, we're about 80% in climbing. Copy that, Douglas. I'll make sure that he adds those in for the website. I know that they should have been added in, but let me just make a note of that. So we'll make sure that you guys can fast forward and go back and forth on these as well. Travis, if you're on, if you can just do that for Monday's recording. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at it. We got 10% with A, 11% with B, and the majority of class with the correct answer, 77% with C. It is going to be when requested, so you may have to do it, but it's always going to be when requested when we're looking at it. Okay, so a report on an incident for which notification is required shall be only filed or be filed only as requested by an authorized representative of the board. Okay, so just keep that in mind. All right. Last thing we're going to cover in this section is going to be inoperative equipment. So you guys have already seen this, and the thing that I usually do with this is just kind of show you guys that anytime that you go into an airplane, you're basically looking for all of the required documents and the required inspections, which was the AVIATED, right? AVIATED. And the reality is just because you have all the documents and all the inspections done does not necessarily mean that the aircraft is airworthy. The last thing that you have to do is you have to do your walk around and basically check the airplane to make sure that there's nothing that's broken. And a lot of times if you fly long enough, specifically with flight school airplanes and these types of things, there's always going to be something that's broken. In the airlines, I can't tell you how many things were broken over the years. It's just kind of a common occurrence when we look at it. So the last component here is really to go out to the airplane and verify if there's any type of inoperative equipment. If there is inoperative equipment, then we have to figure out, can we legally fly or not? And even if we can legally fly, we then have to kind of think about it as, are we comfortable flying without whatever this equipment happens to be? Okay, so maybe it's a taxi light and you're flying at night and it's not required. Maybe you've never taken off or landed from an airport without a light, a landing light or a taxi light. So you may not be comfortable, nor may it be safe, but it may legally be allowed by the FAA. It just depends. So with this, I'm just going to go into the minimum equipment list. Then we'll take a 5-minute break for those that need to leave, and then I'll go through the process here. The very, very first thing you always have to do is you always have to ask yourself, does your airplane have an MEL, which is known as a minimum equipment list? And 99.9% of you, the answer is going to be no. Most of the time, minimum equipment lists are going to be found in the airlines. It'll also be found for major carriers like cargo carriers like UPS and FedEx. So usually they're going to be found on Part 125, 121, 125, and 135 operations, and also the military uses these as well. The reason why we talk about it is this is the starting point that you're actually going to have to walk through this process with your examiner on check ride day. And this is where the list always starts. Do you have an MEL? The answer is usually no, and then you move on. But let me just explain what the heck it is anyways. So an MEL is basically a list of things that allows the pilots to continue flying the aircraft legally if something is broken. And very simply, they're usually going to be designated for much larger aircraft. So the example I'm giving you here is you guys get to your nice 737. You guys have all been upgraded here as captains, and you're the very, very first captain of the day to check out this aircraft at 6 o'clock in the morning. The flight crew is prepping. Your first officers doing their walk around outside, and your flight attendants are basically doing all the checks that they normally do. And one of the checks that they do is they go to the lavatories and they basically check the smoke and fire detection equipment to make sure that it's actually working. And magically, of course, the front lavatory, the front bathroom is not working. The fire extinguisher is out of order. So what the captain's going to do is they're going to break out their large manual on their iPads or whatever electronic devices they have. They're going to go to the fire protection system. They're going to look at the lavatory fire extinguishing systems. They're flying passengers in the passenger configuration. And then what we've got is in this column, it's going to tell you how many are installed and how many are actually required. So very simply, because it says 0 in the third column there, the number required for dispatch, you can legally take off and continue the operation if this system is not working. But the captain basically has to make sure they follow all of this information here. So for each lavatory fire extinguisher system may be inoperative provided the associated lavatory smoke detection system operates normally. The M is for maintenance function and the O is for operational for the pilot. So for the maintenance person, they're going to need to do something. And then for the pilots, they're going to have to basically make a change operationally. So in this case, for each lavatory, the lavatory fire extinguisher system may be inoperative provided the lavatory waste receptacle is empty, so nobody can put any trash in there. And then finally, B here is that the lab door has to be locked. It has to be inoperative, do not enter, so they can't allow passengers to use it. But flight crew members can use it. So that's really the big change, that they're going to have to note operationally. And then finally, there's going to be a given time period in which the airline and the mechanic is basically going to have to fix this system in order to keep this airplane airworthy. So this letter in the very front here is going to basically be associated with the repair category. So what that's telling us here is that the airline has to fix it within 10 days, but it does not include the very first day that it's discovered. And everything is done in Zulu time in the airline. So it does not include today, but it would include 10 days from today, not including obviously the next couple hours. If 10 days elapses, 10 consecutive days elapses, and they still have not fixed the fire extinguisher system, then the airplane would be grounded at that given point in time. Now, you guys will never have to go through this type of in-depth description, but most students have no clue what an MEL is, so it's better to at least have a general concept of what it is. But it's basically everything that can be broken on an airplane, and it will give you an exception to fly that airplane for a given amount of time. Okay. So what we're going to do when we come back is we're going to do an airplane without an MEL, and we're simply going to follow this AC circular. Now, this AC circular 9167 is no longer, it's an expired circular, but if you read the regulations, what will end up happening is you'll see that all of these steps that I'm basically showing to you guys right now are in the exact same order, and I think it's still a good guidance document. And the important thing that we're going to go through is we're going to go through each one of these steps. We're going to assume that one of our taxi light is not working and we're doing a nighttime flight, and we have to go through step 1, 2 through 6. And remember, a lot of students, what I see have problems with their check rides is they jump immediately to step number 4, or they don't do it in the correct order. You do need to start from the top and work your way to the bottom and do it in the correct order for the purposes of your check ride. Okay, so let's do this. Let's take our final break. For those that need to bow out, have a great night. You guys can catch the recordings here very shortly. And with that, we'll see everybody back in 5. All right, everybody, welcome back from break. And the last couple things that we're going to be doing here, really just kind of figuring out inoperative equipment. So the example that I'm going to give you is I'm going to kind of show you what we're going to look at and where we're going to find the information. And we'd actually have to go through these steps in the following order, basically 1 through 6 there. And then we'd have to make a decision if we, can we legally fly? And if we can legally fly without this piece of equipment, or if it's being broken. What are steps that we have to do in order to fly? And also, is it safe? Are we comfortable flying without this piece of equipment? Okay. All right. So starting off at the very, very beginning here, it basically says during the pre-flight inspection, the pilot recognizes inoperative instruments or equipment. So the very, very first thing that we would do is it's basically going to ask us, is the equipment required by the aircraft's equipment list or the kinds of equipment list? And not every airplane is going to have either one of those. Some may have one and not the other, and some may not have any. Okay, so if your airplane does not have any, either an equipment list or a kinds of equipment list, then very simply all we would do is basically go to number 2. So what an equipment list looks like and where we find that information is it's located inside of the airplane or aircraft flight manual, the AFM, or the pilot's operating handbook for your airplane. And what you would do is you'd go to the following chapters. So traditionally in the newer aircraft books, you would find your aircraft equipment list in chapter 6, if it does exist, and you'd find your kinds of equipment list, the KOEL, in chapter 2. So you'd actually want to check both locations. Once again, you may have one or the other. You may have none. It just depends on the manufacturer. Very simply, if we're looking at an aircraft equipment list, this is found in your weight and balance section of the chapter 6. And really what we're doing is we're looking for the item number. We're looking for anything that basically has an R after it. The R is going to basically represent that it's a required item of equipment for the FAA certification. So if anything with a R, an item number with an R is broken or inoperative, then that means the airplane is effectively grounded until it is fixed. The other letters that we have are S for standard equipment, O is for optional equipment, which replaces the required or standard equipment, and then A is optional equipment and items which are in addition to required or standard equipment. So very first thing, assuming that our airplane did have an equipment list, we would go to chapter 6, we'd look at the equipment list. So for example here, if the electric clock, or basically the clock inside of the airplane, was broken, we can see here that a basic clock is standard. The optional upgraded clock, which is the digital version, is also not a requirement. So if that was the case, then we would actually go to step number 2. Now, if the magnetic compass was broken, maybe it was leaking fluid, or potentially our fuel gauges were also broken or separately broken, then because it is a required item for certification, the airplane is going to be grounded until those items are fixed and then signed off by the associated mechanic. So that's what an equipment list looks like. If you do not have an equipment list, you might have what is known as a KOEL, which is a kinds of equipment list. And a kinds of equipment list, this is one that I pulled from a Piper Warrior. It's basically a PA 28160. This is located in chapter 2 or section 2 of the POH AFM, where we basically have aircraft limitations. And all it is it's basically going to tell you if you're operating during the day for a daytime flight VFR, these are the things that you absolutely need to have working. If you're operating at night, you need to have everything in the daytime list and the nighttime list. And then on the other page, they even have an IFR list. So if anything was broken out of this list, depending on whether it's a daytime flight or a nighttime flight, then the aircraft would be grounded until you got that fixed. Assuming that you did not have that list, or potentially you couldn't find the item on the list, the thing that we're saying is broken is we're doing a nighttime flight and our taxi light is broken. And let's assume we couldn't find it on here. Okay, so very simply, that was step number 1. If you can't find it, then you basically continue down to step number 2. And it says, if no, is the equipment required by the VFR type certificate requirements prescribed in the Airworthiness Certificate regulations? This is a document that we call the TCDS, or Type Certificate Data Sheet, TCDS for short. And very simply, you can search for your TCDS by manufacturer or make, model, or serial number. You can go to the FAA website and basically search by a number of different current models or past models. Once you find the correct model, you're going to find usually a PDF document, and that PDF document will actually house quite a bit of different makes and models. So very simply, the one that I'll show you right now is basically going to be for the Cessna 172, which is a pretty common airplane out there. And what that looks like is, this is the document right here. So this is page 15, so I can just go back to it. The very, very front page of it, this is your type certificate data sheet. And this document, which is about 30 pages, basically includes the information from the FAA about all of these aircraft here. Okay, so all of the 172s, the basic 172, the Alpha, all the way through the Sierra models, which is one of the more recent ones. So your airworthiness certificate is basically your birth certificate of an airplane. This document is providing information in terms of how did the FAA actually certify this airplane to deem whether it was airworthy. So what you would do is, depending on the make and model, let's assume we were looking at a 172 through the 172Q, it would actually have all of the information, including the serial numbers for the aircraft, so that way you can make sure that you're actually looking at the correct airplane. It has all of the regulations in terms of how this thing was actually certified, what years was it based upon, and what we're actually looking for is this section that's basically called equipment. Okay, so the equipment in all of these airplanes is the following, and it's basically stating that you need to have this equipment must include a current airplane flight manual effective with the following serial number. So you'd make sure you'd have that information in there. And then for number 1, if you're between model 172 through 172 Gulf, you need to have a stall warning indicator with the following drawing, and then basically the same thing for anything beyond 172 Hotel and beyond. So usually, for the most part, most 172s, you're required to have a working stall warning indicator, a horn, whatever style is actually in your aircraft. So in the event that your stall warning horn was broken or your indicator was broken, this document basically states that if it's broken, you got to fix it. Otherwise, the airplane is then grounded. And every aircraft is slightly different. Pipers don't have this requirement. You're not required to have a stall warning horn. It just depends, and you can find this information once again on your on the FAA website. Okay, so that's what your type certificate data sheet is. In this case, if we look up the type certificate data sheet, we're not going to find anything required that's dealing with a taxi light. So then what we do is we move on to step number 3. So step number 3 is, if no, then what we're doing is we're cross-checking against any airworthiness directives. Are there any outstanding airworthiness directives that we need to comply with or that we have to follow? In order to get to airworthiness directives, you can search the FAA website and basically effectively go to regulations and policies and then go to airworthiness directives, and then you can actually search by make and model. This is what an airworthiness directive looks like, by the way. So this is for these are for Cessnas, and it basically applies to all these models, all these 205 and 210 models. That's what that list is in bold. And the compliance for this thing is basically stating that it is required within 100 hours time in service after the effective date of this airworthiness directive. So if you're the owner of this airplane, or you're going to fly this airplane, you would basically have 100 hours from the date you received this airworthiness directive to make sure that whatever needs to be done is actually done. All this stuff down here, basically A through D, is telling the mechanic what exactly they need to accomplish, what they need to do, what they need to inspect or replace. And then they're actually going to sign off that they've, the airworthiness directive has been complied with. Now, a lot of times, if you're at a flight school, they usually make this a bit easier where you're not having to search the FAA site. They usually have it in some type of Excel format printed out, so that way you can cross-reference them fairly easily. Okay, so if there are no airworthiness directives that apply, then what we do is we go to step number 4. So if no, then what we have to do is we have to look at the following regulations: 91-205, 207, 209, and 215. So quickly here, 91-205 is all of our airworthiness requirements for instrument and equipment requirements. And if you were to go into your current copy of the FAR AIM in under 91-205, you would actually go to section B here, and you can see that this says the Visual Flight Rules Day, and you're going to have a list of a number of different items listed here. And if you continue reading, you'll see visual flight rules for night, and then you'll see instrument flight rules as well. So these are not in any particular order. There's actually greater detail in the Federal Aviation Regulations than the one I'm going to show you. I'll give you a cheat sheet for that. We actually use a mnemonic called A tomato flames for the daytime VFR and also flaps for the nighttime. If something was broken, potentially your ELT, your emergency locator transmitter, you would actually go to 91207. Even though it is required, there's a couple loopholes that allow you to continue flying without an ELT. One of the loopholes that I can tell you kind of off of my memory here is that if you're just doing a training flight and you're staying within 60 nautical miles of your primary airport, you have up to 90 days to basically get that ELT repaired. And you're not flying for higher, then you can basically kind of wiggle around the rules because that's one of the loopholes. Aircraft lights 91209 is in here, and then the last one is your aircraft transponder and altitude reporting equipment. So this is basically, if you lost your transponder or your ADS-B, where can you legally fly and where do you actually need one? So potentially, you might have had a flight where you were required to have an ADS-B and a transponder, but maybe you can manipulate your flight plan and kind of get in and around whatever area you're intending on flying by kind of just changing the path and where you're actually going to go. So that would be basically the next step. And the way that we remember 91205 is the following. So we basically put those in a better order. We call this A tomato flames. So that we've got anti-collision lights, tachometer, oil pressure gauge per engine, magnetic compass, airspeed indicator, temperature gauge, oil temperature gauge, fuel gauge per tank. Flotation is only going to be for higher, so and that is basically your life preservers, those types of things, and that's assuming that you are for hire and outside of gliding distance of the actual land. Landing gear indicator for those that have retractable gear, an altimeter, a manifold pressure gauge for more advanced aircraft, usually those that have a constant speed or variable pitch prop, emergency locator transponder, and then your seat belt or shoulder harnesses. It's always important to read the regulations though, because there are, for example, safety belts and shoulder harnesses and also the anti-collision light. If you have an older aircraft, you might be grandfathered in where you might be certified and you do not need to have either one of those. So I'll leave that up for a second, let you guys write those down, and then we'll look at the nighttime ones as well. Or you guys can take a screenshot of it, whatever's easier there. These you will get asked on your check ride, by the way, as well. You might see these on a couple of FAA tests. All right, after this, all of your daytime requirements, if you are operating at night. So for us, we're saying that we're doing a nighttime VFR flight and our taxi light or our landing light is not working. So what we would do is we would have to have everything within the column that we see for H tomato flames. And then for our nighttime requirements, we would have to have flaps. So most of you are not going to be operating on fuses, but if your aircraft still had fuses, you would need to carry at least 3 sets of each type of fuse. If you're on circuit breakers, then you don't need to worry about that. The landing light is only required for hire. So in this case, we're not for hire, right? If we're a student pilot or a private pilot, we are definitely not taking people because that's above what our capabilities are. So in this case, we can operate the airplane at night without a landing light or a taxi light. We are required to have an anti-collision light, a position light, and a source of power, which is very simply could be, a source of electrical energy like a battery. Okay. So now that we know that we can continue this flight, we have to do a couple things prior to just jumping in the airplane. We have 2 options. We either have to basically, the easiest way is basically to deactivate and placard whatever is broken. So you would basically, put in whatever you did. If you needed to do maintenance, maybe you replaced the bulb, maybe you didn't replace the bulb, maybe you just need to notate it or squawk it that the light is actually inoperative. And then very simply, we just take either a Post-it note or like those little printable pieces of tape and basically use the word inoperant and kind of put that right next to or on the circuit breaker or the switch that we have. Now, deactivating it is usually going to be pulling the circuit breaker. If you do not know what the circuit breaker is, then just leave it alone. You do not want to accidentally turn off some other system inadvertently. The other thing that you can do, besides basically deactivating and placarding it, is basically to remove it. This is not something that a pilot will do. This is something that usually a maintenance person will do. So they will actually remove it, and they'll actually put it inside of the aircraft, maintenance manual. And if it is of applicable or appreciable weight, then they'll actually have to do a new weight and balance. Usually it's over a certain percentage. Finally, after you do all of those steps, step number 6 is always the most important. We know legally that we can actually do a nighttime flight without a landing light in this circumstance. We've actually placarded it and deactivated it. Now we have to kind of look at step number 6, which is you, the pilot in command, has to make a final determination to confirm that the inoperative instrument or equipment doesn't constitute a hazard under the anticipated operational conditions before release for departure. So can you safely make this flight? And based upon your own capabilities, are you comfortable doing so as well? Maybe you've never operated without a landing light for takeoff or departure, and you're just not comfortable going on this flight. And at that point, very simply, you're just going to call it a day, and that's really about it. Okay? So that is inoperative equipment in a nutshell. You might have to watch that again. There are several different steps. What I would encourage you to do is basically become familiar with the aircraft that you're intending on flying, and whatever aircraft that happens to be, take a look at your approved flight manual and or your whatever manual you have, pilot's operating handbook or approved flight manual, and just kind of familiarize yourself with, do you have an equipment list? Do you have a kinds of equipment list? Go look up your type certificate data sheet or any of the other information as well, and kind of see what you guys can figure out. Okay, so with that, let's go ahead and push on, and we're actually going to look at airport operations. As I said, this is 2 parts. We'll finish up anything we don't finish tonight on Friday, so don't worry like you're falling behind or anything. All right, so let's talk about airport layouts. Now, anytime that we're dealing with an airport, obviously there's going to be some type of associated runway with it. And runways are not just, paved in any old fashion or location. There's usually quite a bit of environmental studies that are done, and then what ends up happening is they figure out whatever the prevailing wind conditions are of that area or region. So usually if you see only a single runway, for the most part, those are going to be the most favorable wind conditions. If you start to see a lot of different runways that crisscross, sometimes those could be either very shifty winds like the Denver area, which kind of comes from any direction at any point in time, or they may just need additional facilities to take off and land. So the airport layout is really always going to be designed around the actual runways themselves. And the important thing here is that the runways are actually going to be lined up magnetically. Okay, so what they do is they basically pave these suckers down, and they will round up or down to the nearest tenth the number that you guys see. So for example, runway 27 is actually going to be 270 degrees magnetic, and that was rounded up or down to get to 270. So it could have been 271 or 272 degrees, or it could have been 268 or 269. We don't know without actually looking at the airport diagram. Very simply, what you guys need to know, though, is you always want to put a 0 after whatever the number is on the runway. So, for example, runway 3 becomes basically 030 magnetic. Runway 21 is 210 magnetic. Runway 26 is 260 degrees magnetic, and runway 8 is 080 magnetic. Okay, so it's always going to be rounded to the nearest tenth when we look at this. Keep in mind that magnetic is going to be different than true north. So remember, magnetic is about 1,300 miles away from the true North Pole, basically your geographic north when we look at it. One of the things that we do anytime that we line up on the runway to confirm that we're actually utilizing the right runway is we are going to be basically verifying our heading indicator or directional gyro, and we're also going to be double checking the information on our compass as well. So if I am lined up with runway 26, I should see roughly about 260 on both of these devices, and that's basically my confirmation that I am lined up with the correct runway. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at a question here, and let's see if we can figure this one out. These are pretty easy as well. So the numbers 8 and 26 on the approach ends of the runway indicate that the runway is oriented approximately. Is it 008 and 026 true, 080 and 260 true, or 080 and 260 magnetic? All right, got about 50% of the class in. About 70%. All right, about 90%. All right, let's take a look at this one. Apologize if I cut anybody off. We got nobody with A, so that's a good start. We got 7% with B and 92, almost 93-ish% with C. So majority of the class does have it correctly. Remember that basically runway 8 is going to be 080, and runway 26 becomes 260. So we're always adding a 0 to the end, and that's going to be the magnetic direction. Remember, everything on the ground and basically anything that you hear direction-wise on a radio is going to be magnetic. We do use true. True is going to be primarily for flight planning, and we'll talk more about the differences moving forward. So really, runway 1 is going to be 010 magnetic all the way to our last runway, which would be 360. Our runway 36 would be 360 degrees. So you basically have them every 10-degree increment. Now, where you can find the exact information in terms of, what is the exact number, magnetic direction of a runway, very simply, if you were to go to any type of airport diagram, I'll show you this one because we're going to look at this one here in a minute anyways. This is one for Camarillo, California. So that was our home base a while ago. Let me go ahead and rotate this so you guys can see it. Very simply, we can see here, we've got runway 26, and this right here is the exact direction. So runway 26 is 258.5 degrees. And what they're doing is they're rounding that up to 26. So that becomes 260 degrees. If we look at the flip side of it, we've got runway 8, and the exact magnetic direction of runway 8 happens to be 78.5 degrees magnetic. They've obviously rounded that up to runway 8, so that's basically approximately 080. Okay, so that's how they're coming up with those numbers when we are specifically looking at it. The next thing that we're going to talk about is going to be your airport facility directory. For those of you that are on Facebook or YouTube, just look at the description, and I provided a link for you guys, and you guys can download these. These are physical books that you can purchase as well. They do come in different areas. So the one I'm looking at is in the supplement for the Southwest area, which covers California and parts of the Southwest as well. When you guys are looking at these, if you look on the very first couple pages, there is basically a legend, and I'll let you guys basically look through it. But if you go through all of first, I can't believe how many acronyms there are. Starting off with roughly around page 12, this is the sample page in terms of how to read the chart supplement. And this is obviously giving you everything under the sun in terms of what could potentially appear and how it's actually codified. I will show you guys basically the highlights of this. I'll show you the most important segments when we look at this, but here's a good example. And then basically you can cross-reference any of these numbers 1 through 30 plus. Just keep scrolling down and you'll actually see all of, all the information right below that in terms of what are the definitions and what's supposed to be in these locations for number 1. And the list kind of goes on and on from there. Okay. So for those that got C, great job. Let's go ahead and look at the chart supplement. So the chart supplement is formerly known as the Airport Facility Directory, AFD, for any of our older pilots out there. You'll hear me kind of reference it as the Green Book as well. We use the Green Book for quite a lot of things to kind of look up information. And anytime that we're going to a new airport or we're, any airport that we go to, we want to look at the Green Book because it provides a lot of information about the traffic pattern altitude, our frequency information, hours of operation, or any other special remarks about the airport. Now, the chart supplement is a total of 7 volumes. It covers all of the United States, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands. And it provides data on all FAA public airports, seaplane bases, heliports, military facilities, and also selected private use airports that the DoD wants. Within this document, you're going to be able to find all of those airports by state, and then within each state section, you'll be able to search for them alphabetically. It does provide at the larger airports, airport sketches. You'll also have navigation aids or nav aids, which are basically navigational equipment and frequencies information in there. You have communication data, weather data sources, airspace information, special notices, VFR waypoints, airport diagrams, operational procedures. There's telephone numbers in there for air route traffic control centers. There's VOR checkpoints in there, and there's a bunch of IFR stuff as well. So you can basically take a look at those as we kind of push forward, and I'll show you guys what they look like here in just one second. So here is that sample that I just showed you guys, and let me do this. I know the folks on Facebook and YouTube have this, but let me just give you guys a copy for those that are on our website so you guys can take a look at this. Starting on page 16, this is kind of the blown up version, so if you guys want to download that and take a look at that, doesn't matter. This is the Southwest one, but you guys can, this information, the legend is effectively in all of the chart supplements. Anyways, the most important stuff that I can kind of point out for you guys here is, obviously, it will have the city name and the airport name, but here's going to be your airport code. Your airport code will generally start with a K. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't, at least within the continental United States. The number here is going to reference where the location is from the city, whatever the major city is. So this airport happens to be 3 north of the city, or the city is 3 north of the airport, that is. In order to convert any of the Zulu times, very simply, here's our conversion. So we would have to subtract 6 hours, or if it's daylight savings time, we'd actually subtract 5 hours. The GPS coordinates are there, the latitude and longitude. Number 8 is basically letting us know where is this airport located if we were to look at any one of the charts. So this airport we could find on the Jacksonville sectional, the copter, which is for helicopters, and then a bunch of IFR charts, the high and low IFR charts as well. Number 11 is an important one. This is telling us the field elevation. So we're going to use this quite a bit for takeoff and landing purposes to try to figure out the traffic pattern altitude. So in this case, the field elevation of this airport is at 200 feet, so very close to sea level. TPA is traffic pattern altitude. This is the altitude that we fly the traffic pattern in. And it's always going to have our MSL value and then our AGL value. So we would fly this at 1,000 feet MSL, and that would put us 800 feet above the ground, AGL. Okay. Some of these others like AOE, we're not going to worry about. That's airport of entry. So if you wanted to, we'll talk about it anyways. If you're flying back in to the United States, you'd have to go to an AOE airport, basically one that has U.S. Customs and Border Protection Services, so you could get your passport and stuff checked. Continuing on, number 19 here, anytime they're going to have any type of runway, the runways will be listed, and they'll basically provide information in terms of the runway length, the runway width, and then how, is this what type of runway is this? Is this asphalt? Is it gravel? Is it sand? Is it dust? What is it? So this one happens to be 12,004 feet long, 200 feet wide. You can ignore the S, D, and all this stuff. That's basically single, dual, and double dual axles. Basically, that's the max weight that this concrete can support. This is important. This stands for high intensity runway lights, HIRL lights. We'll talk more about airport lighting before we end today. And then specifically for each runway, they're going to give you a number of different, acronyms, such as, your MALF systems, your touchdown zone lights, your runway end identifier lights, your precision approach path indicators. And these are all the different lighting systems associated specifically, in this case, with runway 18. Continuing down, you're always going to have on 21 runway declared distances. The one that we primarily pay attention to is something known as LDA, which is your landing distance available. All these others, you basically have your takeoff runway available. So the runway total length for you to use for takeoff is 12,004 feet. We've got a total distance available of 12,004 feet, and then an available stopping distance of 11,704. But for some reason, this is a shortened runway. It only has 11,504 feet versus 12,000 feet. And we'd actually have to look at the description to probably figure out that there's a displaced threshold, which is basically something that we can use for takeoff, but we cannot use for landing. Arresting gears and systems, you're only going to find those at military airports. Your services are going to primarily deal with any type of fuel. So if you need to figure out, does it have fuel? Can you refill your oxygen bottles? You can find that information here. You can also find information on pilot-controlled lighting that we'll talk about here in a little bit, and the rest of the stuff is kind of military-related as well. Going to the next page here, depending on the complexity of the airport, you're going to find airport remarks. You always want to read through the airport remarks, see if there's anything unusual. There might be wildlife in the vicinity of, you might have parachuting in the area as well, or anything that's relatively pertinent to that airport. So sometimes they're fairly short and sometimes they're fairly long. So in this case, if I was looking at this airport, I would be interested in that there's parachute jumping, there's deer in the vicinity of the airport, and there's some type of heavy jumbo jet training from the surface to 9,000 feet. That would be something that would pique my interest. All of the other stuff we're going to talk about, our radio communications and our weather section. So this all down here, that's how we pick up our weather. That's how we figure out the frequencies to talk to ground and flight service stations, tower, and everything else in between. We also have airspace information in here, so we can see that this is a Class Bravo airport. And then any of our navigational aids, if there are any located on the airport itself, they will be listed under this section called Radio Aids to Navigation. So some airports are very, very small when it comes to the chart supplement, and some of like the larger airports, the bigger airports like LAX, for example, Los Angeles International, you could see that these will be multiple pages and cover lots of different charts and those types of things as well. Okay, it's your responsibility as pilot in command to basically become familiar with all available information, and that does include information within the chart supplement. So make sure that you at least brief it and kind of have a general idea of what is important about that airport that you are taking a look at. Now, the other thing too is that every time you go to a towered airport, or basically an airport that has a control tower that is in operation, you're always going to listen to something called ATIS. And if you're on the ground, the very, very first thing you do after you start the engine is you're going to listen to ATIS, and then you're going to call a controller on the ground to ask for taxi instructions. If you're flying into an airport that has an operating control tower, you're going to listen to ATIS usually 20, 30 nautical miles away, and then you'll actually talk with the tower controller to get permission to go into the airspace. So no matter what, basically ATIS is your very first stop if you are going in or out of a control, basically an airport that does have an operable control tower. So ATIS stands for Automatic Terminal Service, Terminal Information Service. This is usually going to start off with you have information, Bravo, Alpha. It's always going to be in the same order, Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, Delta, etc. Okay, so for example, for the 7 o'clock hour, they may say that is information Alpha. And then as soon as it's 8 o'clock, it might be information Bravo, and so forth. So I'll have you guys listen to two different variations of them. This is going to broadcast non-control information at towered airports to relieve frequency congestion. And it provides information on weather, so ceiling, wind, visibility, or anything else that's pertinent. It will provide information on the active runways, any notice to airmen or other pertinent airport information, taxiway closures, runway closures, anything that's going on. And it's going to be normally updated every 55 minutes past some type of significant change. So a significant change could be them changing their runways that they're using. They could flip the entire airport for takeoff and landings. It could be that there's a thunderstorm, or maybe the airport went from VFR to IFR. So very simply, traditionally what will end up happening is that at most airports, the controllers will read the weather, and they're going to start off with Camarillo information alpha, time. They'll give you the time, they'll give you the weather conditions and all the other pertinent information, and then they'll end it with you have information alpha. It's your job to write down this information, and your very, very first contact with either a ground controller or a tower controller, you're going to let them know, obviously, who you are, where you are, what you want to do. But more importantly, you also want to tell them that you have listened to, or you have whatever the information of the hour is. Okay. If you do not have the information of the hour, a lot of times they'll tell you, go back to ATIS, get the information, then call me back. Okay. So what I want to do is we're going to go and listen to one with a tower that is actually open and operating. This is going to be a smaller local tower. What I would like you guys to do is we'll try to listen to it twice. Attempt to write it down to the best of your ability. We'll listen to this one, and then I'll listen to a digital ATIS, which is more of a robotic voice, but you'll see there it's going to provide roughly the same information. With that, let's go ahead and listen, see if you guys can copy it down. I'll let you guys listen to it roughly 2 or 3 times until it kicks me off the system here.
155 Zulu, wind to 240 at 6, visibility 9er, sky clear, temperature 18, dew point 13, altimeter 29er 88, GPS approaching use, landing and departing runway 26. Touch airmen at taxiway Gulf between Gulf 1 and Gulf 2 closed until further notice. Equipment go approaches on 123.75. All aircraft read back hold short instructions and runway assignments with your call sign. Advise initial contact information, Quebec. Maria Airport information, Quebec 0155 Zulu, wind to 240 at 6, visibility 9er, sky clear, temperature 18, dew point 13, altimeter 29er 88, GPS approaching use, landing and departing runway 26. Touch airmen at taxiway Gulf between Gulf 1 and Gulf 2 closed until further notice. Equipment go approaches on 123.75. All aircraft read back hold short instructions and runway assignments with your call sign. Advise initial contact information, Quebec.
We can get it one more time.
Airport information, Quebec 0155 Zulu, wind to 240 at 6, visibility 9er, sky clear, temperature 18, dew point 13, altimeter 29er 88, GPS approaching use, landing and departing runway 26. Touch airmen at taxiway Gulf between Gulf 1 and Gulf 2 closed until further notice. Equipment go approaches on 123.75. All aircraft read back hold short instructions and runway assignments with your call sign. Advise initial contact information, Quebec.
All right, everybody. So let's see if we can break that down. Now, these controllers talking fairly fast. Some talk fast, some talk slow. I guarantee you when you guys are starting off, you'll probably have to listen to these controllers a few different times, or unfortunately, these are all recording. So very simply, it starts with the information of the hour. So that it's information Quebec, and that's the important thing we want to write down. This was for Camarillo Airport, and the time that this was reported was 0155 Zulu. So in about another 10 minutes or so, or 11 minutes, they should come on with a new recording. The current conditions when this was reported was wind was 240 at 6 knots, 9 statute miles visibility, temperature of 18 degrees Celsius. The dew point was 13 Celsius. Here's where we get that local altimeter setting. That's 29.88. They are landing and departing runway 26, and it looks like they were talking about using the GPS system. On taxiway Gulf, between Gulf 1 and Gulf 2, the taxiway was closed indefinitely, and then they have a Point Mugu, basically a departure frequency of 123.75. Okay, so what I want to do is I'm going to give you guys a different variation of that, and what we're going to do is we're going to scooter over to a Class Charlie airport. If you go to a larger airport, you will generally hear a more automated or robotic voice per se, and this is what we call digital ATIS. We call these D-ATISs, and it works exactly the same way. A digital ATIS basically allows certain more advanced aircraft to basically, get their clearances, via text message per se. Like mainly airlines have an opportunity to utilize these systems. So for the most part, you're still going to have to listen to the frequency and actually write down the information. The digital ATIS is going to talk a little bit slower. I'll try to let it play at least twice, depending if it gets me kicked off the line. See if you can copy down the information for this airport, which will be Ontario. Okay.
Ontario International Airport ATIS information Zulu 0153 Zulu. Wind 250 at Niner. Visibility 10. Sky clear below 2000. Temperature 27. Dew point 10. Altimeter 2985. ILS and visual approaches in use. Runway 26 left. Landing and departing runway 26 left. Notices to airmen. Runway 26 right, 8 left closed. Taxiway Victor closed between runway 26 right and taxiway November. Taxiway Foxtrot closed between runway 26 left and taxiway Sierra. Taxiway Sierra closed between taxiway Foxtrot and gate 703. TWY Sierra closed between Kilo the Foxtrot except wingspan left stand 11. 8 feet. Attentional aircraft hazardous weather information for Southern California available on flight service station frequencies. Pilot pre-track runway assignments and post-short instructions. Advise on initial contact. You have information Zulu.
We can do it one more time.
Ontario International Airport ATIS information Zulu 0153 Zulu. Wind 250 at Niner. Visibility 10. Sky clear below 2000. Temperature 27. Dew point 10. Altimeter 2985. ILS and visual approaches in use. Runway 26 left. Landing and departing runway 26 left.
All right, everybody. So these are all systems that you do have the ability to call in, and of course it kicks you off over a certain amount of seconds. Obviously we hit that limit here, but just real briefly, it will repeat this over and over and over. So with ATIS, it updates roughly every 55 minutes past the hour. Give it plus or minus a couple minutes on either direction, depending on if the controller gets busy or not. Digital ATIS is pretty much always going to be around 50, around 55 as well. So in this case, if we kind of go back, it's just going to keep repeating. And then once the new hour approaches, which is very soon here, because this was taken almost an hour ago at basically 153 Zulu, we're coming up to roughly 248 Zulu right now. So we're almost due for a new one. Instead of being the information of the hour is Zulu, it'll actually revert back to the beginning of the alphabet of Alpha. Okay. So very simply, the current information over at Ontario, at least what I could copy down, would be information Zulu. We had the time of 0153 Zulu when it was reported. The wind conditions were 250 at 9 knots, 10 statute miles visibility. The sky was clear. Temperature was 27 Celsius, dew point 10 Celsius, and the altimeter was 2985. They were basically landing and departing both the visual and the instrument landing system 26 left. And then they had kind of a litany of different closures. So I wrote them down on a different piece of paper, but basically I had runway 26 right, 8 left was closed, taxiway Victor was closed between runway 26 right and taxiway November. We had taxiway Foxtrot closed between runway 26 left and taxiway Sierra. Taxiway Sierra was closed between taxiway Foxtrot and the gate. And then taxiway Sierra was also closed. So didn't even have a room to write those on the screen for you guys, but you would probably want to list those out and basically note any closures that may or may have, if it is going to potentially affect you when you get on the ground. Okay, so that is what ATIS sounds like, just so you guys have an idea. That's one of the very first things that you're going to listen to. And then from this point, if we were taking off from this airport, now what I would do is I'd contact ground and I'd let them know who we are, where we are, what we want to do. And if I'm taking off from Camarillo, very simply, I let them know, oh, by the way, I've got information Quebec. Or if I'm taking off from Ontario, hey, I've got information Zulu. Okay, so that's really the first step of what we would do there. All right, anytime that we're taxiing in and around an airport, very simply, the taxiways are always going to be alphabetical or alphanumerical. So you're never going to have a taxiway that's going to start with any type of number. Numbers 1 through 36, and really any number is really just going to be associated with runways. So that way we don't get it confused. Taxiways will usually be Alpha Bravo Charlie, or you could have at larger airports Alpha Alpha or Alpha 1, Bravo 2, whatever the numbers are, but it will always be alphanumerical. A number by itself is going to indicate that that is specifically a runway. At airports like this, it's pretty simple to actually kind of navigate. We can see Alpha, we've got Bravo, Charlie, Delta, Echo. Foxtrot is the long inner one, and then we've got Hotel, which is also kind of splits right down the center of this runway. Now, in the airport diagram, these are official FAA diagrams that we have here. So very simply, in the upper left-hand corner, this is providing the information, starting with ATIS. We have Camarillo Tower, we have ground control, clearance delivery, and Point Mugu as well, which would be for our departure information. So anytime, if we were going to basically start right here, and that's where the aircraft is parked, first thing I would do is I'd listen to ATIS, and we just listened to ATIS for Camarillo. We found out that they were effectively broadcasting, was it Quebec, I believe? Quebec. So I would write down all that information, and then I would contact ground to basically get my taxi instructions. And very simply, I would let them know, Camarillo ground, Cessna 1234. I'm over at, I don't know, ABC Flight School, and I'd like to do a straight out departure. I have information Quebec. And then from there, they're going to go ahead and give me some taxi instructions. Now, very simply, there's really only two ways to get to runway 26, if that's what they're using. Simplest way is they could come back to me and say, all right, Cessna 1234, go ahead and taxi to runway 26 via Foxtrot Alpha. And all I'm going to do is basically follow Foxtrot all the way down, make the right turn at Alpha. The run-up area is right here. But always write down your taxi instructions. Always have a taxi diagram out when you're taxiing. One of the more important things that you also need to know is that when you're taxiing, anytime you receive taxi instructions, it does not give you instruction to clear or take off from a runway. You cannot take off from a runway, and you cannot cross any runway unless you get explicit instructions to do so. Okay. Now at an airport like this, there's no runways to cross because there's only a single runway. But in the example I'm going to show you guys next, we're going to go to Long Beach International Airport, and I'm going to give you guys some taxi instructions, and I want to make sure that you're not crossing any runways that I'm not giving you permission to cross. Okay, that's very, very important. Kind of the takeaway of what we're looking for here. Like I said, always write down your taxi instructions, both when you're taxiing out for takeoff and also when you're coming back in to land. And you can kind of abbreviate. Usually what I do is we'll usually do something like, if it's something complex, let's say it's Foxtrot, Alpha, Bravo, Charlie. Okay, you can put like a little / in front of it. The other thing we would do in the airlines as well is maybe you want to go from Alpha Alpha. I want to cross runway 21, and then you want me to hold short of Charlie. Anytime that we want to hold short, we usually do 2 / so that way we can actually note that we're actually supposed to stop and not continue any further at that point. Okay. So this is what your taxi diagram looks like. Here is your runway length, the 6,013, and then the 150 feet wide. We also have the runway numbers. The field elevation is here. And then we also have the exact magnetic that we talked about previous to this as well. It does show a general layout of the hangars. We also have the tower location right here. And this star is basically indicating the airport beacon that exists on this airport here. Okay. All right, so the very last thing I want to do before we run out today is talk about this taxiing from point to point. So very simply, if we were at Long Beach, California, this is one that has 3 runways. It actually used to have 5 runways. They decommissioned a few of them. And what I'll do is I will have one of the moderators for those on the website share exact taxi diagram if you guys want a larger taxi diagram, or actually I can do it myself here. So give me 1 second. For those on the website, here is the taxi diagram. For anybody on Facebook or YouTube, the taxi diagram is located in the it's actually located in the description section of your video. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you guys to taxi from your current position all the way to runway 26 right. Okay. So you guys are going to be at the very base of the tower here, and the base of the tower is located right here, and we're trying to get you guys to go all the way down here to 26 right. And make sure you've got a piece of paper and a pencil. Give you guys a second to grab that. And when you guys are ready, I will repeat your taxi instructions a couple times. Okay. Long Beach ground, Cessna 764 Charlie Papa, taxi to runway 26 right via Foxtrot, Foxtrot 1, cross runway 26 left via Delta, Golf, Charlie, Kilo, Kilo 1. Okay, I'll repeat that again for you guys. Make sure you write it down and then figure out on that taxi diagram, where is your airplane? Did you make it all the way to the end or somewhere in between? Long Beach ground, Cessna 764 Charlie Papa, taxi to runway 26 right via Foxtrot, Foxtrot 1, cross runway 26 left via Delta, Golf, Charlie, Kilo, Kilo 1. Does anyone else need me to read it back again? Okay, read it back one more time. Long Beach ground, Cessna 764 Charlie Papa, taxi to runway 26 right via Foxtrot, Foxtrot 1, cross runway 26 left via Delta, Golf, Charlie, Kilo, Kilo 1. For those that can't see the chart, remember, you guys have an opportunity. I put it in the chat. You guys can open up that link that I threw in there. I'll throw that in once again. You guys can put that in your browser and it'll open up a full-size PDF. If you're on a cell phone, unfortunately, it doesn't get much bigger than that. So, all right, so where did everybody end up at this point? Where did everybody end up? Did anyone make it all the way to the end where we're basically trying to go of 26 right? Basically right here. Made it all the way to 26 right, if anybody. Okay, a couple people made it all the way out there. Some people are holding short. Good. LB's got it. Resting clearance for takeoff. All right, so let's see. Remember what I said in terms of you can only cross a runway if you have explicit instructions to do so. So very simply, here's your zoomed in version. And I'll kind of go through here's the instructions at the very, very top here. Okay. So the route is that red line that I drew, and here's our starting point. And very first thing that I'm allowing you guys to do is taxi to runway 26 right. So we're trying to get over here all the way in that upper right-hand corner. And we're given via Foxtrot. So here's Foxtrot. Okay, then via Foxtrot 1, which is basically going to take me up to the edge of 26 left. Cross runway 26 left. That's an explicit instruction to cross runway 26 left. So now I'm on the other side of that runway. Continue via Delta. And I'm going to take Delta all the way up until I get to Golf. Okay. And here's Golf. Now, you'll notice the difference here is that you did not receive an explicit instruction to cross this runway, which is runway 12 and 30. So if you do not have explicit instructions to cross, you have to hold short. So for those that held short and are basically sitting right here, great job, you did the right thing. For those that continue to cross that runway and continued via Golf, Charlie, Kilo, and Kilo 1, you ended up here, but you went a little bit too far, okay? Now, normally, this is a longer taxi instruction than you would probably get given. They would probably honestly tell you to, hold short of the runway at this point, okay? So it might sound like Cessna 764 Charlie Papa, taxi to runway 26 right via Foxtrot, Foxtrot 1, cross runway 26 left, continue via Delta, Golf, hold short of runway 3012. That's that long one I'm drawing that squiggly line through, okay? And then at that point, you could just hold short and you can either announce that you're at that position. Keep in mind the tower pretty much already knows, or the ground controllers know you're there. So they'll usually call you back when they're ready to get you across that runway, okay? So the lesson here is that you need to stop at any runways that you do not have explicit instructions to go through. This is an explicit instruction, cross runway 26 left. Everything else is basically directions to get you to the end result, but you may not have the authority to do so, okay? If at any point in time you are unsure if you're unable to cross, even if right here, maybe we're on Foxtrot 1 at the beginning and I can't remember if the controller told me I can cross 26 left or not, come to a complete stop, and it's better to ask the controller once again, hey, just reconfirming, am I cleared to cross 26 left, or do you want me to hold short, right? It's better to come to a complete stop at that point and ask again. This is also the reason why you can see with some of the longer taxi instructions, it's important to write these down because these are going to escape your memory very, very quickly. A lot of people, when you guys are doing this, I see students who will write them down, and I also see students who basically take these things digitally, and effectively what they'll do is they'll just highlight the route as the controller is basically talking about it, and that way they can kind of follow it just like a highlighted or red line that we have here. Now, in the event you are going to a more complicated airport like this one's fairly complicated, multiple runways. We have civilian operations, military operations. We have scheduled commuters like JetBlue flies out of here, and then you also have flight training companies as well. A lot of helicopters. So if you're unfamiliar with an airport, the other thing you can do is ask for something known as progressive taxi. Progressive taxi is basically going to give it to you in very, very small chunks. And it would probably be Cessna 764 Charlie Papa, continue via Foxtrot, and then hold short. Okay, they're just going to give it to you. They're literally going to break this up into 10 different sets of instructions, and they're basically going to give it to you piece by piece. Okay, so they'll give it to you until you get to Foxtrot. Then they'll give you the next part. All right, continue via Foxtrot, cross runway 26 left, and stop on the other side. Okay, then continue via Delta and stop when you get to Golf. Continue via Golf and hold short of the big runway. Cross the runway and then hold short on the other side. Continue via Charlie and stop when you get to Kilo. And they're going to give it to you in those little increments like that. So if you're truly lost, they do have the ability to do that, and that is actually known as progressive taxi. Okay, very expensive lesson, yes, if you're doing this. That was called progressive taxi, right? All right, so with that, that is everything I wanted to cover for the purposes of tonight. What we're going to do when we come back is we are going to cover the airport lighting. We'll also cover runway markings, and then we're going to move into how to get in and out of the airport and also deal with these things called runway incursions. If anybody here crossed that runway like we had a bit earlier, basically if you guys ended up crossing this big runway here, that would have been a runway incursion, meaning that the aircraft, basically any aircraft, any person or vehicle that is somewhere either on a taxiway or runway that does not belong there, does not have permission to be there, is the definition of a runway incursion. And we'll be looking at those as well on Friday. Okay. So with that, I hope everyone enjoyed the class. If you liked it on Facebook or YouTube, hit the like button. I'll stick around for any questions you may or may not have. But other than that, have a great night, everybody. Stay safe, and we'll see you back here on Friday. All right, everybody. So that basically wraps up everything that we wanted to cover for today's class. As we kind of push on, remember, if you want to take or basically attempt today's lesson quiz, you're more than welcome to take that college try. If you want to wait until we basically wrap up the rest of the material, you can always wait until we get to that point. So it's not going to hurt you if you take the lesson quiz in 2 days from now. Not a big deal. In addition to that, we're also going to try something new just for this week. So with the Q&A, the Q&As are, because I have a class right after this, we're going to attempt to do the Q&As basically using the moderators and also our tech team. So if you have any questions, feel free to just throw them in the chat. And we're just going to see if this can increase the efficiency a little. We're going to do a little bit of a test over the next couple days and see if this works or not. But other than that, if you have any questions that we weren't able to answer in the meantime, remember, if it's aviation related, you have the Facebook group, which is a great opportunity. Very, very easy to find a quick answer there. You have Ask a CFI, which is on our website. Remember, when you log in, you can basically throw in a question. It's like a discussion forum. You can also see the hundreds of questions that students have basically submitted and we've answered. We typically check those, and I review those 2 to 3 times a day. In addition to that, if you have a technical question, I know Travis and the tech team is going to remain on as well with you. If there's something that they weren't able to answer, you might need to open up a technical help, or basically a help desk ticket. That is, remember, in the lower right hand corner of your screen, there's that little yellow headset. Just click on that and you can click on submit a ticket to start that process. Just be as specific as possible. So with that, I hope you guys are enjoying the classes so far. What we'll do here is I am going to go ahead and sign off and prepare for my next class. Moderators and the IT team is going to stick around and answer any last minute questions that you have. We'll keep the chat open, making sure everybody's questions are answered. And I will see everybody in about a day and a half, 2 days for our next lesson. Take care, everyone. Stay safe, and we'll see you later.